A royal marriage between Egypt and the Hittite Empire was meant to end decades of war. The groom, an Egyptian prince, left for Hatti, but he never arrived. Hittite records accuse Egypt of betrayal. Egyptian records respond with silence. The prince's name disappears, his fate goes unrecorded, and one of the ancient world's most extraordinary diplomatic missions ends without a confirmed explanation. For centuries, archaeologists have searched temples, royal tombs, and forgotten cities hoping to fill the missing chapters of Egypt's past. Each excavation uncovers another inscription or burial that promises clarity, yet just as often it reveals new contradictions that make the story even harder to untangle. Our search begins with the prince who vanished between two empires. The clay is broken in places, but the cuneiform still holds its shape after more than 3,000 years. It was found among the ruins of Hattusa, the Hittite capital in what is now central Turkey, in a diplomatic archive buried beneath collapsed mud brick. Among treaties, trade lists, and royal correspondence, one letter stands apart, not for its size, but for its tone. It carries the voice of a mother's grief, written in the words of Putuhepa, great queen of the Hittites. She writes of a marriage that was promised and never completed. She writes of a prince who was supposed to come north from Egypt and who never arrived. The background is straightforward enough at first. In the late 13th century BC, Egypt and Hatti had only recently ended decades of war, sealed by the famous peace treaty following the Battle of Kadesh. To strengthen that fragile peace, a marriage was arranged. An Egyptian princess would travel to Hatti to wed into the royal family, or, in this particular exchange, an Egyptian prince was to journey the other direction, toward a Hittite bride. Royal marriages like this were common currency in the ancient world, a way of binding former enemies through bloodlines instead of battle lines. Nothing about the arrangement itself was unusual. What is unusual is what happened next, or rather, what did not happen. The prince set out. That much seems clear from the correspondence. And then, somewhere along the route, whether in the deserts of the Levant, the mountain passes of Anatolia, or before he ever crossed Egypt's own borders, he disappears from the record entirely. Putuhepa's letters grow pointed, almost accusatory. Where is he? Why has the marriage not taken place? Was there a death, an illness, a change of heart on the Egyptian side? The Hittite queen wanted answers that, as far as we know, were never fully given. Or if they were, they did not survive in any text we've recovered. Egyptian sources, for their part, say nothing at all. No inscription names this prince. No tomb has been identified as his. In a civilization that recorded royal lineage with obsessive care, carving names into stone precisely so they would outlast memory, this is a strange kind of silence. Was he a minor son, unworthy of monumental record? Or was his disappearance the kind of failure a pharaoh's court preferred to erase rather than explain? Mainstream historians offer reasonable possibilities. Ancient travel was dangerous. Disease, accident, banditry along contested borders could account for a young man never completing his journey. Diplomatic marriages sometimes collapsed quietly when political winds shifted, and scribes on both sides simply stopped mentioning an arrangement that had become an embarrassment. It's possible the prince died of nothing more mysterious than a fever, and the silence that followed was simply how Egypt handled loose ends. But the specificity of Putuhepa's anger has invited other readings. Some researchers have wondered whether the prince's disappearance masked something closer to political sabotage, a faction within Egypt unwilling to see the alliance solidified through marriage. Others have pointed to the timing, so close to a fragile peace, and asked whether a rival power might have benefited from the match falling apart. These theories remain speculative, built more on the shape of the silence than on any direct evidence. What we're left with is a single archive, a queen's unanswered questions, and a name that was never recorded on either side of the border. Somewhere between Thebes and Hattusa, a prince meant to secure peace between two empires simply stopped existing in the historical record. Did he die quietly, forgotten by scribes who saw no reason to commemorate him? Or does his absence conceal something the ancient world chose never to write down? A century before the Prince of Hatti ever set out on the road that would swallow him, and 1,000 miles closer to home, Egypt was already no stranger to silence. Long before diplomats exchanged letters about a missing bridegroom, another figure had gone missing from the record in a far more violent way. Not a single prince, but an entire kingdom, and the war that may have ended it. His name survives on only a handful of objects. A scarab seal here, a fragmentary king list there, an inscription so worn that scholars still argue over how to read it. Dedumose, a pharaoh of the 13th or 14th dynasty, ruling during the Second Intermediate Period, a stretch of Egyptian history so fractured, so poorly documented, that historians sometimes simply call it the Dark Age, between the Middle and New Kingdoms. Centralized power had collapsed. Regional dynasties rose and fell within years, sometimes months. And somewhere in that chaos, foreign rulers known as the Hyksos were tightening their grip on the Nile Delta, establishing a kingdom of their own on Egyptian soil. It's in this fractured world that Dedumose appears, and it's in this same fractured world that he seems to have fought a war we can barely reconstruct. The evidence is thin, but it is not nothing. A stela, damaged, incomplete, its lower portion lost, references military conflict during a period that lines up with Dedumose's reign. Some Egyptologists connect this fragment to a campaign against the Hyksos, a desperate attempt by a weakened Theban or Delta-based king to push back against the foreign dynasty encroaching from the north. If this reading is correct, Dedumose wasn't simply a minor ruler cycling through a chaotic era. He may have been a wartime king, commanding what remained of Egyptian sovereignty against an enemy that would, within a generation or two, control a significant portion of the country. And yet almost nothing else confirms it. No detailed battle account exists, no triumphant inscription describes a victory, and no honest record describes a defeat. We don't know where the fighting took place, how large the armies were, or how long the conflict lasted. We don't even know with certainty how Dedumose's reign ended. Some king lists suggest a short rule. Others imply he may have been one of several overlapping claimants to power during a period when multiple men may have called themselves pharaoh simultaneously, each controlling only a fragment of the Nile Valley. This is where the mainstream picture reaches its limit. Most Egyptologists treat Dedumose's war, if it happened at all, as one skirmish among many in a long, grinding contest between Thebes and the Hyksos, a conflict that wouldn't reach any real resolution until Kamosi, and then Amozii finally drove the Hyksos out more than a generation later. In that reading, Dedumose is simply an early, unsuccessful chapter in a war that other, better documented kings would eventually win. His obscurity isn't evidence of anything sinister. It's simply what happens to losing rulers in unstable periods. Their records go unmaintained, their monuments get reused or dismantled, and their names slowly erode out of institutional memory. But the fragments invite other questions, the kind that resist easy answers. Why does a possible pharaoh's war leave so little trace in a civilization that otherwise recorded military campaigns with such pride? Rameses II would later cover temple walls with his own battles at Kadesh, real and exaggerated alike. If Dedumose fought and lost against the Hyksos, why is there no account, not even a hostile one, not even a later scribe's brief mention meant to explain how Egypt fell under Hyksos dominance? Silence after victory can be explained by modesty or loss of records. Silence after a pivotal defeat is harder to account for. Some researchers have speculated that Dedumose's reign, and whatever war he fought, may have ended not simply in military defeat, but in something closer to collapse. A kingdom that didn't just lose a battle, but ceased to function as a coherent state shortly afterward. If true, this would mean the absence of records isn't an accident of preservation. It would mean there was, for a time, no functioning administration left to keep records at all. Egypt wouldn't be the only ancient civilization to experience this kind of near-total institutional breakdown. But applied to a pharaoh whose name we can barely reconstruct from broken stone, the idea becomes difficult to prove and just as difficult to dismiss. Others have gone further, into territory Egyptology treats far more cautiously. wondering whether Dedumose's war and the abrupt vanishing of Egyptian resistance that seems to follow it might connect to something beyond the political rivalry with the Hyksos. Environmental stress, plague, even the broader pattern of collapse seen across the eastern Mediterranean in later centuries have all been proposed, at various points, as contributing factors to the Second Intermediate Period's chaos. None of these theories rest on solid evidence tied specifically to Dedumose. They exist in the space his silence leaves behind, space that fringe and mainstream researchers alike have tried in very different ways to fill. What remains, in the end, is a name on a scarab, a broken stela that may or may not describe his war, a reign whose length no two king lists fully agree on, and a kingdom that, whatever Dedumose did or didn't accomplish, was clearly losing ground to a foreign power it would not fully expel for generations. Did Dedumose die commanding an army in a battle no later scribe wanted to remember? Did his kingdom simply dissolve beneath him, leaving no one left to record the final chapter? Or is the story larger than one king, larger than one war, a fracture in Egyptian history so complete that even its causes were lost along with its documentation? The stone that might answer these questions, if it ever existed at all, has not yet been found. Far south of Thebes, past the cataracts where the Nile turns wild and unnavigable, lies the rock-cut facade of a tomb at Kubbat el-Hawa, overlooking Aswan from a bluff above the river. Carved into its walls is a text that has been read and reread by Egyptologists for more than a century, not for its praise of the gods or its record of offerings, but for what it reveals about a world Egypt rarely let its own inscriptions describe, the world beyond its borders. This is the tomb of Harkhuf, a provincial governor and expedition leader who served under two pharaohs of the 6th Dynasty, and whose autobiography remains one of the most detailed travel accounts to survive from the Old Kingdom. Harkhuf led 4 expeditions into Nubia and beyond, into a region the Egyptians called Yam, a land whose exact location remains debated to this day, somewhere in the deep south, possibly in modern Sudan, possibly further still. His inscriptions describe these journeys with unusual specificity. The months spent traveling, the goods brought back, ebony, incense, panther skins, elephant tusks, and the diplomatic relationships he built with local rulers along the way. For 3 expeditions, the pattern is more or less consistent. Harkhuf travels, trades, negotiates, returns. Old Kingdom Egypt expands its reach south through commerce and careful diplomacy, and Harkhuf's tomb is his reward, a record of loyal service inscribed for eternity. Then comes the 4th expedition, and the pattern breaks. The inscription tells us Harkhuf departed with a smaller escort than usual, traveling what he describes as the Elephantine Road, a route distinct from the one used on his earlier journeys. Almost immediately, the tone of the account shifts. Yam, previously a stable trading partner, appears to be at war with a neighboring people called the Chimi. This is worth pausing on. Harkhuf doesn't say Egypt was at war. He says Yam was, that the ruler he dealt with before was now occupied with a conflict of his own, one Harkhuf had to navigate around rather than through. Why does an Egyptian expedition leader suddenly find himself threading a path through someone else's war? What made this route, and this timing, necessary in the first place? The mainstream explanation is straightforward enough on its surface. Trade routes shift. Political situations in foreign territories change unpredictably, and a seasoned expedition leader adapts his path accordingly. Harkhuf had made this journey before. He knew the region, had relationships with local rulers, and was equipped to reroute around instability. In this reading, the 4th expedition isn't a mystery so much as a demonstration of Harkhuf's competence. Proof that Egypt's southern trade network could survive regional turmoil precisely because men like him knew how to work around it. But then the inscription offers something else entirely, something that has fascinated Egyptologists far more than the politics of Yam ever could. Harkhuf writes that he is bringing back a specific gift for the young pharaoh Pepi II, a dancing dwarf of the god, a pygmy from the deep south, brought north for the royal court. And appended to Harkhuf's own account is a letter, copied in full onto the tomb wall, written by Pepi II himself, then still a child king. The letter is almost breathless with excitement. The pharaoh instructs Harkhuf to guard this dwarf carefully on the journey north, to check on him constantly, to make sure he doesn't fall into the river, insisting that if he arrives safely, Harkhuf will be rewarded beyond anything given to previous expedition leaders. It's a remarkable document, one of the earliest known personal letters from an Egyptian king, preserved by Harkhuf specifically because it was the greatest honor of his career. And it's here that the strangeness of the fourth expedition deepens, rather than resolves. Why would royal correspondence of this intensity be reserved for what should have been, on paper, a smaller and more difficult mission than the previous three? Why does a child pharaoh's fixation on a single individual overshadow, in the historical record, whatever conflict was unfolding in Yam? Was the dwarf's presence at court tied to something beyond curiosity or diplomatic novelty? Religious significance, perhaps, given Pepi's own phrase, dancer of the god? Old Kingdom Egyptians did associate certain physical differences with divine or ritual meaning, but how far that belief extended, and why this particular acquisition mattered so much to a boy king, is something the inscription never fully explains. Some Egyptologists have proposed that the fourth expedition wasn't primarily a trade mission at all, but a mission with this acquisition as its central, perhaps original, purpose. That Harkhuf was sent south specifically because word had reached the court of such an individual living among Yam's people, and everything else, the shifted route, the smaller escort, the careful diplomacy around a foreign war, was in service of retrieving him successfully. If true, it would mean the political instability Harkhuf describes wasn't the central event of the journey at all, but an obstacle to something else entirely. Something the pharaoh wanted badly enough to write a letter no other expedition ever received. Others have looked at the geography itself, at the still unresolved question of where Yam actually was, and wondered whether the answer might reshape how far south Old Kingdom Egypt's influence truly extended, whether this fourth journey pushed further into contact with peoples and places barely hinted at anywhere else in Egyptian records. We're left, in the end, with a tomb wall carrying two texts side by side, a governor's careful account of a mission gone strange, and a child king's letter revealing more excitement than policy ever should. Was Harkhuf's fourth expedition simply a resourceful response to unstable politics abroad? Or did it serve a purpose the inscription only partly discloses? One where a dancing dwarf, and not the war in Yam, was the true reason a small escort braved an unfamiliar road. Tomb walls carrying royal words have a way of outliving the kings who commissioned them, and at Abydos, one of Egypt's oldest and most sacred burial grounds, entire walls of royal names have quietly rewritten what we thought we knew about a stretch of Egyptian history most textbooks use to summarize in a single sentence. Where Harkhuf's inscription preserved a child king's letter, the monuments at Abydos preserve something stranger still. Evidence of an entire royal line that ruled, minted its own kings, built its own tombs, and then vanished so completely that modern Egyptology didn't even know to look for it until archaeologists stumbled onto the proof in the ground itself. For decades, the accepted history of the Second Intermediate Period held that Egypt, during this fractured era, was divided primarily between two power centers: the Hyksos, ruling from the delta in the north, and the Theban dynasty holding out in the south. A clean, two-sided story. Then, in 2014, archaeologists excavating at Abydos uncovered the tomb of a previously unknown pharaoh, Senebkare, along with evidence pointing to an entire sequence of kings buried nearby, a royal necropolis belonging to a dynasty that appears in no surviving king list, no Manethonian chronicle, no inscription anyone had connected together before. It became known simply as the Abydos dynasty, a local kingdom of perhaps a dozen kings, ruling a modest stretch of territory around Abydos itself, sandwiched geographically and politically between the larger powers of Thebes to the south and the Hyksos-dominated north. The tombs themselves tell us this dynasty existed with a strange kind of certainty and an equally strange kind of poverty. These are not grand pyramids or sprawling mortuary temples. They are modest, some reusing older Middle Kingdom material, their kings buried with fewer resources than their more famous contemporaries could command. And yet these were kings, men who took royal titulary seriously, who styled themselves as legitimate pharaohs of Egypt even while controlling what may have been a strip of territory, barely 100 kilometers long. Here was a fully functioning royal court, complete with its own succession, existing almost entirely outside the historical narrative for 35 centuries. Then, as abruptly as the archaeological record allowed this dynasty to reappear, it disappears again. There is no inscription describing conquest. No triumphant Theban text claims to have absorbed Abydos into a unified southern kingdom. No Hyksos record claims to have crushed a rival in the Middle Nile. The dynasty simply stops. Its kings stop appearing in the archaeological layers. Its territory, whatever exactly it comprised, seems to have been absorbed. Quietly, without ceremony, without anyone bothering to record how or why. The mainstream explanation treats this the way historians often treat small kingdoms caught between larger rivals. It was likely swallowed by circumstance rather than catastrophe. As Thebes grew stronger under kings like Kamose and eventually Ahmose I, consolidating power in preparation for the eventual war against the Hyksos, a small buffer kingdom like Abydos may simply have been absorbed into the growing Theban state through negotiation, submission, or a conquest too minor to merit its own inscription. In a period already defined by fragmentation and rapidly shifting regional control, one more small kingdom quietly disappearing into a larger one wouldn't have seemed remarkable enough to record, especially to the victors, who had little reason to commemorate a rival whose territory had never posed much of a threat. But the questions this raises are harder to dismiss than the explanation makes them sound. If Thebes did absorb this kingdom, why do we have no trace of that process at all? Not even a boastful line from a later pharaoh listing Abydos among his conquests, the way Egyptian kings so often catalogued their victories. And if the dynasty wasn't absorbed by Thebes, what does that leave? Some researchers have pointed to the timing of the dynasty's disappearance and wondered whether it coincides with pressure from the north rather than the south. Whether Hyksos expansion, rather than Theban consolidation, played the larger role in ending this small kingdom's independence. Others have raised a more unsettling possibility, that we don't yet have anywhere near the full picture of the Abydos dynasty at all. Seneb-K's tomb was found essentially by accident, its existence unsuspected until the moment it was uncovered. If one previously invisible royal line could hide in the archaeological record for this long, in a site as thoroughly studied as Abydos, what does that suggest about how much of this period remains genuinely unknown? Not mysterious in the dramatic sense, but simply unexcavated, unread, still buried. What we're left with is a dynasty whose existence had to be proven from the ground up, a chronology stitched together from modest tombs and fragmentary titulary rather than the kind of continuous record other Egyptian dynasties left behind. Its rulers reigned as kings. Its rulers vanished as though they never had. Was the Abydos dynasty absorbed quietly into a larger power that saw no reason to remember it? Or does its disappearance point to a conflict, a collapse, or a chapter of the second intermediate period that has simply not been unearthed yet? Somewhere beneath the sand, still waiting for the accident that will reveal it. A kingdom can vanish without a single record explaining why, as the Abydos dynasty shows us. But sometimes it isn't a kingdom that disappears. It's the person meant to hold it together, gone so completely that even his tomb has never been found. Manetho's king lists, compiled centuries after the fact by an Egyptian priest writing in Greek, preserve a name that modern Egyptology has never been able to fully anchor to physical evidence. Merenre Nemtimsaf II, sixth pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, son of the long-reigning Pepi II. It's a name that exists almost entirely on paper, in later king lists, in fragmentary references, while the archaeological record that should confirm and flesh out his reign remains almost silent. And what little the record does suggest is stranger than silence alone would be. According to the Turin King List, one of ancient Egypt's most valuable chronological sources, Merenre II ruled for a period recorded as shockingly brief, Some readings suggest as little as 1 year, perhaps only a matter of months. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what came before him. Pepi II's reign is traditionally counted among the longest in recorded human history, a staggering 90-plus years on the throne according to ancient tradition, though modern scholars debate whether that number reflects reality or later exaggeration. Even accounting for uncertainty, there's little doubt Pepi II ruled for an extraordinarily long time, long enough that the pharaoh who should have inherited Egypt from him, his own son, may have been an old man himself by the time the throne finally became available. Merenre II, in this reading, wasn't a young king cut down in his prime. He may have been a king who arrived far too late, already elderly, already unable to provide what a destabilizing kingdom desperately needed: time. And time is precisely what Egypt didn't have. The end of the Sixth Dynasty marks, by most accounts, the effective collapse of the Old Kingdom itself, the beginning of the First Intermediate Period, an era of fragmented regional power, weakened central authority, and, according to later Egyptian texts like the admonitions of Ipuwer, genuine social upheaval. Merenre II's reign sits right at this fracture point, precisely where the machinery of centralized pharaonic rule seems to seize and fail. Was his brief reign a cause of that collapse, or simply its earliest visible symptom? The mainstream explanation leans toward the latter. Egypt's central authority had likely been weakening for years, even decades, before Merenre II ever took the throne. A slow accumulation of pressures, including the increasing power of provincial governors, strain on resources, and administrative fatigue after nearly a century under one aging king. In this reading, Merenre II wasn't a king who caused a collapse through weakness or failure. He was simply the last name attached to a system that had already been hollowed out from within, a brief and largely powerless figurehead presiding over the final moments of a kingdom that was going to fracture regardless of who sat on the throne. But the specifics resist easy resolution. If Merenre II's reign really was as short as the Turin list suggests, how did he die? No cause is recorded. No tomb has been definitively identified and excavated with his name attached, which is itself unusual for a pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, an era that generally left behind substantial funerary monuments even for lesser documented kings. Some Egyptologists have tentatively associated a small, unfinished pyramid structure near Saqqara with his reign, but the identification remains uncertain, the structure too damaged and too sparsely inscribed to confirm. A king who may have ruled the most powerful nation on earth at the exact hinge point of one of history's great civilizational collapses, and we cannot say with confidence where his body was laid to rest. This gap has invited a range of interpretations. Some historians have wondered whether Merenre II's brief reign points to a succession crisis more turbulent than the surviving record admits. Perhaps a contested throne, rival claimants, even the possibility of violence within the royal family itself, the kind of power struggle later, better documented dynasties make no effort to hide, but which the deliberately curated Old Kingdom record may have simply chosen not to preserve. Others have focused less on Merenre II individually and treated him as a symbol, a marker for how completely Old Kingdom Egypt's information systems broke down as central authority failed. If regional administrations were already fracturing during his reign, perhaps the reason we know so little about him isn't concealment. It may simply be that no one, anywhere in Egypt, was left with the resources or the stability to properly record what was happening at the top. What remains, across 3,500 years, is a name in a damaged papyrus, a reign measured in months rather than decades, and a kingdom sliding into fragmentation almost the moment he took power. Somewhere in that overlap between an old king's death and a young dynasty's collapse lies a story we may never fully recover. Did Merenre II die of natural causes, an elderly heir simply unable to hold together what his father's excessive reign had already destabilized? Or did his brief time on the throne conceal a struggle for power that Old Kingdom Egypt, in its final and most fragile days, could no longer afford to record? Picture a papyrus fragment, brittle and yellowed, its surface so damaged by insects and time that entire columns of royal names dissolve into gaps mid-sentence. This is the Turin king list in its rawest form, not the clean scholarly reconstruction you see in textbooks, but the actual object, a document torn apart by 19th century handling before anyone understood its value, its pieces scattered, some lost outright, others reassembled decades later in an order historians still debate. Nowhere in this papyrus is the damage more consequential than in the section covering the 14th dynasty, a stretch of Egyptian history where the list alone claims dozens of kings, by some reconstructions more than 50, reigning in a span of time too short to plausibly hold them all. The 14th dynasty ruled, or claims to have ruled, from the eastern delta city of Avaris, during roughly the same turbulent stretch of the Second Intermediate Period that produced the Abydos dynasty further south. But where Abydos left physical tombs for archaeologists to eventually stumble onto, the 14th dynasty exists for us almost entirely as names on a broken list. Kings whose reigns, in the list's own damaged numbers, sometimes last a single year, sometimes mere months, one after another, an almost dizzying churn of rulers, claiming a throne that seems to have offered no one much stability at all. What could produce a rate of succession like this? A dynasty burning through dozens of kings faster than most single reigns elsewhere in Egyptian history isn't simply unusual. It suggests something was actively preventing any one ruler from consolidating power long enough to build the kind of lasting monument, the kind of extended administrative record that later Egyptologists could use to properly reconstruct his reign. Kings who don't last long enough to matter, in the historical record, rarely leave enough behind to be remembered as more than a name in a damaged line of hieratic script. The mainstream explanation for this rapid turnover points to the broader instability already well documented across the Second Intermediate Period. Centralized Middle Kingdom authority had fractured. Regional power centers, including whatever administration controlled Avaris before and during early Hyksos influence in the Delta, may have been especially vulnerable to internal power struggles, factional infighting, or simple weakness in the face of external pressure from population movements and political shifts already underway in the eastern delta. Some Egyptologists have proposed that many of these 50-plus kings weren't ruling successive unified reigns at all, but were instead overlapping or rival claimants, men who styled themselves as legitimate pharaohs while actually controlling only fragments of contested territory simultaneously, which would mean the list isn't recording one chaotic dynasty so much as flattening several competing, short-lived power grabs into a single deceptive sequence. But even this explanation runs into the same wall every investigation of the 14th dynasty eventually hits. We don't have enough to confirm it. The Turin papyrus itself is damaged precisely where confirmation would need to come from. Names are missing. Numbers are illegible or contradictory between different scholarly reconstructions. Some of the kings the list implies existed have no corroborating archaeological evidence whatsoever, not even a single scarab seal bearing their name, while others are known only from such seals, with no textual reference connecting them to a specific position in the succession at all. Historians attempting to build a coherent timeline of the 14th dynasty aren't reconstructing history so much as arguing over the shape of a puzzle with most of its pieces missing and no box lid to check the picture against. This uncertainty has left room for genuinely divergent theories. Some researchers have suggested the extraordinarily rapid succession might reflect not just political instability, but a genuine crisis of legitimacy itself. A period when the very concept of a unified Egyptian kingship was breaking down in the Eastern Delta specifically, with regional elites cycling through figurehead rulers while real power rested elsewhere, in hands the historical record never names at all. Others have focused on the timing, noting that this dynasty's chaotic final years appear to overlap with the early stages of Hyksos political dominance in the same region, and have wondered whether external pressure and internal collapse were happening simultaneously, each accelerating the other, until whatever remained of 14th dynasty authority simply dissolved into the arriving Hyksos state rather than being formally conquered by it. What survives is a broken document listing kings we mostly cannot place, in an order we cannot fully verify, ruling for spans of time too brief to have left the kind of evidence later generations would need to understand them. Even the total number of kings remains a matter of ongoing scholarly disagreement, revised as new fragments of the papyrus are studied and reassembled. Was the 14th dynasty truly a single line of legitimate kings, cycling through rulers at a pace that reflects deep, unresolved political crisis? Or does the papyrus itself, damaged and reordered by centuries of mishandling, preserve a distortion, one that has turned rival claimants and overlapping regional powers into a single dynasty that may never have functioned as one at all? Amid the chaos the 14th dynasty's broken king list leaves behind, one contemporary figure stands out with unusual solidity. Sobekhotep IV, a 13th dynasty pharaoh whose reign, unlike so many of his rivals and successors, actually left substantial physical evidence behind. Statues, stelae, inscriptions at Karnak, even a large rock-cut relief at the Third Cataract in Nubia. For a period defined almost everywhere else by fragmentary names and missing years, Sobekhotep IV is something rare. A king we can actually see in stone, asserting real authority across a significant stretch of the Nile Valley. That makes what happened after his reign all the more difficult to explain. Sobekhotep IV appears to have ruled for somewhere close to a decade, an unusually stable tenure for the 13th dynasty, a period otherwise characterized by the kind of rapid royal turnover we've already seen echoed in the 14th dynasty's chaotic list. His monument suggests a functioning, resourced administration, capable of major building projects and military presence as far south as the Nubian frontier. By the standards of his era, this was a successful reign. And yet when we look for evidence of who followed him, of a prepared heir stepping into an office his father had spent years stabilizing, we find almost nothing. The succession immediately after Sobekhotep IV's is genuinely unclear. Some king lists suggest a brother, Sobekhotep V, took the throne next, which would itself be unusual, bypassing a direct son in favor of sibling succession. Other reconstructions propose additional short-reigned kings filling the gap, their relationship to Sobekhotep IV uncertain or entirely unstated in the surviving record. No inscription clearly names a designated son as his intended successor. No text describes a smooth, prepared transition of the kind Egyptian royal ideology worked so hard to project. The pharaoh as eternal and unbroken office passing seamlessly from father to chosen heir. Instead, the throne seems to pass sideways, uncertainly, among a cluster of men whose exact relationships to one another remain a matter of ongoing scholarly reconstruction rather than settled fact. For a king who left behind this much physical evidence of his own authority, the silence around his succession is striking. Did Sobekhotep IV simply have no surviving son? It's possible. Child mortality and the general fragility of ancient life make this a mundane, entirely plausible explanation requiring no hidden drama at all. A king can build monuments across an entire kingdom and still lose every child before adulthood. If so, the sideways succession to a brother wouldn't be a crisis so much as a practical solution to an ordinary demographic problem, the kind of transition royal families across history have quietly managed without leaving behind any record of struggle. But the alternative explanations are harder to dismiss outright. Egyptian royal succession, particularly during periods of relative strength like Sobekhotep IV's reign, usually shows at least some effort to project continuity, even when the reality behind the scenes was messier. The near-total absence of any named heir, any inscription proclaiming a prince as intended successor, even in the abstract formal language pharaohs typically used regardless of a child's actual age or readiness, has led some Egyptologists to wonder whether a son did exist and was simply passed over, deliberately excluded from a succession that instead favored an adult, presumably more politically capable brother during a period when the 13th dynasty, despite Sobekhotep IV's individual strength, still existed under the same regional pressures that would soon fragment further into the chaos we associate with the 14th dynasty and the Hyksos advance. If that's true, it raises a further question. What happened to that hypothetical son? Ancient successions passed over for political reasons don't always end quietly. Sometimes the bypassed heir disappears from history because he was simply too young or too politically weak to press a claim. Sometimes, in other periods and other kingdoms, such figures reappear later as rivals, or vanish through means the official record has no interest in documenting. Egypt's own history holds precedents for succession disputes turning violent, even if the formal inscriptions covering them never say so directly. Whether anything like that happened here remains entirely speculative. There is no direct evidence of foul play, no accusation preserved anywhere in the fragmentary record. But the shape of the silence, a strong king's monuments abruptly followed by an uncertain and sideways transition of power, is exactly the kind of gap that invites the question, even if it can't supply an answer. What we're left with is a pharaoh unusually well documented for his era, whose reign speaks clearly through stone at Karnak and along the Nubian frontier, and a succession immediately afterward that speaks hardly at all. The throne moved to someone, a brother most likely, though even that remains debated, while whatever became of any direct heir, if one ever existed, has left no trace anyone has yet identified. Did Sobekhotep IV's line simply end through the ordinary tragedies of ancient life, passing his throne peacefully to an able brother in a kingdom that needed stability? Or does the missing heir represent something the 13th dynasty's court had every reason to leave out of the official record entirely? It's worth pausing here for a moment on a pattern that keeps repeating itself. Again and again in this period of Egyptian history, we find a name attached to almost nothing else. No tomb, no clear reign length, no certainty about what came before or after. It happened so often across the 13th dynasty that Egyptologists have almost grown used to it. But few cases are as strange or as thin as the one belonging to a king known to us only as Neferkare VII. The name itself is part of the problem. Neferkare was one of the most frequently reused throne names in Egyptian history, adopted by multiple pharaohs across different dynasties, centuries apart, each hoping to invoke the prestige of earlier kings who had carried it before them. This particular Neferkare, distinguished from the others only by the Roman numeral modern historians have assigned him, appears in the damaged Turin king list among the long, uncertain sequence of 13th dynasty rulers, a dynasty already notorious, by this point in our investigation, for kings who occupied the throne so briefly and left behind so little that entire reigns exist for us as nothing more than a name in a broken line of hieratic script. What sets Neferkare VII apart, even within this crowded field of barely attested kings, is the near-total absence of anything beyond that single listing. No monument confirmed to bear his name has been identified. No stela, no statue fragment, no scarab seal, nothing that would let an archaeologist point to a physical object and say with confidence, "This king existed, and here is proof independent of the papyrus that first named him." For many of his obscure contemporaries, at least one small object survives to anchor the name to something tangible. For Neferkare VII, by most current reconstructions, even that is missing. This raises a question that sits underneath much of what we've already explored in this period. What does it actually mean for a pharaoh to disappear? For Sobekhotep IV's possible heir, disappearance meant an absence from a record that otherwise documented the king himself extensively. For the 14th dynasty's overlapping claimants, it meant names crowded together on a damaged papyrus with no way to verify the sequence. But Neferkare VII represents something more extreme, a king who may exist for us as nothing more than an accident of scribal record-keeping, a name copied down by ancient chroniclers compiling a king list centuries after the fact, with no surviving evidence that anyone in his own era considered him significant enough to commemorate in stone. The mainstream explanation is almost anticlimactic in its plausibility. The 13th dynasty, as we've established repeatedly throughout this period, cycled through kings with extraordinary speed, some ruling for a matter of months before being replaced. A king who held the throne only briefly, during an era of already weakened central authority and shrinking royal resources, may simply never have had the time, the stability, or the funds to commission the kinds of lasting monuments that let later generations confirm his reign independently. In this reading, Neferkare VII isn't mysterious so much as unlucky. one name among dozens who happened to rule during exactly the wrong window of Egyptian history to leave any lasting trace, preserved only because a scribe compiling the Turin Papyrus, generations later, had access to administrative records that have since been lost to us entirely. But this explanation, however reasonable, runs into the same difficulty we've encountered before. Reasonable isn't the same as confirmed. If the Turin king list's compilers had access to administrative records precise enough to include a king this obscure, what were those records? And why have they left no trace anywhere else? Some Egyptologists have wondered whether names like Neferkare 7 represent something more complicated than simple brief kingship, perhaps regional or contested rulers whose authority was recognized in only part of Egypt, included in later king lists more out of chronological completeness than genuine unified reign. If true, the very act of listing him as a standard pharaoh, equal in format to kings who ruled the entire Nile Valley for decades, may be flattening a far messier reality, one where king meant something far less absolute than we assume. Others have taken the uncertainty further still, questioning whether every name in this stretch of the Turin list represents an individual, distinct ruler at all, or whether scribal errors, damaged source documents, or attempts to fill gaps in an already incomplete administrative record might have introduced names that don't correspond cleanly to any single historical king. This remains a minority position, difficult to prove and equally difficult to disprove given how little independent evidence exists either way. What survives in the end is barely more than a fragment of ink on damaged papyrus, a name that may represent a real king who ruled and vanished too quickly to leave a mark, or something stranger still, a gap in the record that later chroniclers filled with more confidence than the evidence actually warranted. Did Neferkare 7 sit on Egypt's throne for a handful of months, ruling and dying too fast to build anything that could outlast him? Or does his name mark something else entirely, a shadow in the record where the truth of the 13th dynasty's fractured succession has simply never been recovered? Move north now, out of the fragmentary papyrus fragments and damaged king lists, to the western hills of Thebes, where a very different kind of document survives. Not a list of names, but a confession. Centuries after the 13th dynasty's obscure kings faded from memory, this same landscape produced one of ancient Egypt's most infamous criminal records, the Abbot and Amherst Papyri, court documents from the reign of Ramesses IX, detailing the trial of tomb robbers caught looting the royal necropolis. Among the plundered tombs named in these documents is one belonging to a 17th dynasty pharaoh, Sobekemsaf II, whose burial, the papyri tell us, was broken into, stripped of its treasures, and left desecrated. His body, according to the confessions extracted under interrogation, burned. Sobekemsaf II himself is reasonably well attested for a king of this turbulent era, a period when Thebes ruled only a fraction of Egypt while the Hyksos still controlled the north. Inscriptions confirm his reign, his building activity, his place in the sequence of 17th dynasty kings working to consolidate southern power in the lead-up to the eventual War of Liberation. But it's what happened to his family after his death, and the strange asymmetry between what we know of him and what we don't know of them, that has left Egyptologists with an unusually persistent gap. We know Sobekemsaf II had a queen, Nubkos, whose name survives on monuments alongside his. We know, or believe we know, of at least one son, though the exact reconstruction of the succession that followed remains genuinely contested among scholars, entangled with the same broader uncertainty that clouds much of the 17th dynasty's internal chronology. What we don't have is any clear, continuous record of what became of this family once other names begin appearing on the Theban throne. Did a son succeed him directly? Was there a period of contested succession, perhaps involving relatives whose relationship to Sobekemsaf II remains only speculative in modern reconstructions? The monuments that might answer these questions definitively simply haven't survived, or haven't yet been identified among the fragments that have. Then there's the robbery itself, which adds a second darker layer to the family's story. The Abbot Papyrus describes in the words of the accused robbers themselves, forcing their way into Sobekemsaf II's tomb, stripping his mummy of gold and setting fire to the wrappings before fleeing with the treasure. This wasn't a minor act of theft. It represented, by the standards of Egyptian religious belief, a catastrophic violation, a destruction not just of wealth but of the very possibility of the king's continued existence in the afterlife, his preserved body being central to Egyptian conceptions of eternal survival. The trial that followed was serious enough to generate an unusually detailed paper trail, one of the richest surviving accounts of criminal justice from the New Kingdom. And yet the papyri focus almost entirely on the robbers and the mechanics of the crime, the specific tombs targeted, the goods stolen, the confessions extracted through what the documents describe as physical punishment. They tell us almost nothing about how Sobekemsaf II's own descendants, if any remained prominent enough by that point to have a voice in the matter, reacted to the desecration of their ancestor generations after his death. Was restitution attempted? Was any effort made to restore or rebury what remained of him? The silence here isn't necessarily suspicious on its own. Official Egyptian records often prioritized administrative and legal process over sentiment. But combined with the earlier uncertainty about his family's succession, it leaves us with a king whose life is reasonably documented, whose death and eventual desecration are documented in disturbing detail, and whose family's fate across the generations in between remains almost entirely obscured. The mainstream view treats this as an unfortunate but unremarkable consequence of time and record loss, common enough for a dynasty whose internal succession is already difficult to reconstruct with confidence. Families lose prominence. Records get lost, especially across the political instability that continued to define the Theban kingdom even as it gained strength against the Hyksos. There's no need to look for anything hidden in an absence that ordinary attrition can explain. But some researchers have pointed to the specific brutality of the tomb's desecration and wondered whether it reflects something beyond opportunistic theft, whether Sobekemsaf II, or his line, had accumulated enemies whose hostility outlived him, motivating a robbery more personal than the papyri's businesslike account of stolen gold suggests. It remains a speculative reading, resting more on the severity of the act than on any direct evidence of motive. What we're left with is a king reasonably well documented in life, catastrophically undocumented in the fate of his own body, and almost entirely unaccounted for in the story of the family he left behind. Did Sobekemsaf II's line simply fade quietly from the record, as so many royal families did during Egypt's more turbulent centuries? Or does the violence done to his tomb point toward a hostility that outlasted him, one the surviving records were never meant to fully explain? Centuries before robbers ever set fire to Sobekemsaf II's wrappings, another Egyptian king was already being warned about how fragile a pharaoh's legacy could be, not through the desecration of his tomb, but through the words of his own father, preserved in one of the most remarkable literary works to survive from the ancient world. The text is known today as the Instruction for Merkare, and it takes the form of political advice from an aging Heracleopolitan king to his son and heir, a young man being prepared to inherit a fractured Egypt during the chaos of the First Intermediate Period. The advice is candid to the point of astonishment. Warnings about rebellious nobles, about the dangers of provincial power, about the mistakes of the father's own reign, offered with a bluntness almost no other Egyptian royal text allows itself. The son this advice was written for was Merkare himself, a king who should, by every reasonable expectation, be one of the better documented rulers of his era. He inherited a text explicitly designed to prepare him for the throne, a rare surviving window into the actual political thinking of an Egyptian royal court rather than the idealized ceremonial language most inscriptions preferred. And yet Merkare's own reign, once he actually held the throne, the instruction was written to secure for him, dissolves into almost total obscurity. We know he ruled from Herakleopolis, the northern rival capital contesting Egypt's fractured unity against the rising power of Thebes to the south. We know his father's advice survives. What we don't know is almost everything else. How long he ruled, how his reign ended, or where, if anywhere, his body was laid to rest. This is what makes Merkare's case distinct from so many of the obscure kings already explored in this investigation. This isn't a name surviving only on a damaged king list, a shadow with no independent confirmation of a real reign. Merkare is confirmed, described in advance, prepared for rule by a father who clearly expected him to face serious challenges and wanted him equipped to meet them. And still, the archaeological record has never produced his tomb. No pyramid, no rock-cut chamber, no inscribed sarcophagus fragment has ever been confidently attributed to him. A king whose father wrote him a survival manual for the throne seems, in the end, to have vanished from history almost as completely as kings who left no advance warning at all. The most direct explanation lies in what we know happened to Herakleopolis itself. The instructions' warnings about rebellious provinces and contested power weren't abstract political theory. They described the exact conflict that was already unfolding between the Herakleopolitan kings and the Theban rulers to the south. A struggle for control over a fractured Egypt that would eventually end in Thebes' victory and the reunification of the country under Mentuhotep II, founder of the Middle Kingdom. If Merkare was Herakleopolis's last or near-last king, his tomb may simply have been a casualty of that defeat, destroyed, dismantled for building material, or deliberately erased by a victorious rival dynasty with every incentive to eliminate the monuments of the kings it had just overthrown. Ancient Egyptian history offers precedent for this kind of erasure, most famously in later periods. But the practice of removing a defeated predecessor's name and monuments from the record was hardly new even in the first intermediate period. If this reading is correct, Merkare's disappearance isn't really a mystery in the sense of an unanswered question, so much as a predictable outcome of losing a civil war in an era when victors held every advantage over the historical record. His father's instruction survived by chance, preserved through copies made long after the original context had faded into literary tradition, valued eventually for its wisdom rather than its politics. His tomb, by contrast, had no such path to survival, standing on the losing side of a conflict that Thebes had every reason to erase rather than commemorate. But this explanation leaves harder questions only partially answered. If Merkare's monuments were destroyed by the victorious Theban dynasty, why does no Theban inscription boast of that specific victory, the way Egyptian kings elsewhere in this investigation so often celebrated the fall of a defeated rival? Mentuhotep II's reunification of Egypt is documented, commemorated, built into his own royal narrative as founder of a new, stronger kingdom. Yet the specific fate of Merkare, the individual king the instruction had so carefully prepared, is never named as part of that story. Was he already dead, of natural or unrelated causes, by the time Thebes finally prevailed, making his personal downfall irrelevant to the victor's narrative? Or does his complete absence from Theban triumph inscription suggest something closer to a quiet, unremarkable end, an unremarkable defeat swallowed into the general collapse of a rival kingdom rather than a dramatic final battle worth memorializing? Some Egyptologists have speculated that Merkare's tomb may simply not have been found yet, buried somewhere in the still incompletely excavated necropolises around Herakleopolis Magna, a site that has never received anywhere near the archaeological attention lavished on Thebes or Memphis. If true, it would mean the answer to this mystery isn't lost to history at all, only to unfinished excavation, still waiting beneath ground that no one has yet had the resources or the reason to dig. What survives, undeniably, is his father's voice, urging a son to rule wisely in a fractured, dangerous kingdom. What doesn't survive is any confirmation of how that son's story actually ended. Did Merkare lose his kingdom, his life, and his tomb to the war his father had tried to prepare him for? Or is he still down there, somewhere beneath Herakleopolis, waiting for the excavation that finally connects the king to the council that was supposed to save him? That same idea, an answer still buried and waiting for the right excavation, connects directly to another king whose name has become almost inseparable from confusion itself. Djedneferre Dedumose II shares more than a passing resemblance to the pharaoh explored earlier in this collection, Dedumose I. In fact, for much of the 20th century, Egyptologists weren't entirely certain these were two separate kings at all, rather than one ruler whose name and fragmentary evidence had simply been duplicated or miscopied across different sources. It's a confusion that, in many ways, tells us as much about the state of Second Intermediate Period Egyptology as it does about the king himself. The physical evidence for Dedumose II is thin, though not non-existent. His name appears on a small number of objects, most notably a fragmentary funerary item associated with his burial, discovered in circumstances that themselves left room for uncertainty about attribution. Unlike his namesake, whose possible war against the Hyksos we explored earlier as a case of thin evidence stretched across a single damaged stela, Dedumose II's story revolves less around a specific event and more around the basic, unresolved question of his place in Egyptian chronology at all. Which 13th or 14th dynasty sequence does he belong to? Did he rule from Thebes, attempting to hold together what remained of southern Egyptian authority? Or was his kingship more limited, more regional than the grand title Djedneferre might suggest? Egyptologists have proposed multiple competing placements for his reign across the decades, none commanding full consensus, each resting on a slightly different interpretation of the same scattered fragments. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Dedumose II reigned during a period when the kind of chaos already explored throughout the Second Intermediate Period, fractured succession, competing regional powers, mounting pressure from Hyksos expansion in the north, had reached something close to its peak. If his reign does belong late in this sequence, as some reconstructions suggest, he may have presided over Thebes during one of its most vulnerable periods, potentially in the years immediately preceding the more famous, better documented resistance later mounted by kings like Sekhemre and his sons. In this reading, Dedumose II isn't simply an obscure name lost among many similar obscure names. He may represent a critical, largely invisible hinge point, a king whose choices, whatever they were, helped determine whether Thebes would survive as an independent power at all in the years before Egypt's eventual reunification. And yet his fate, like so many kings explored throughout this investigation, resists any clear resolution. We don't know how his reign ended. We don't know whether he died of natural causes, was overthrown, or was simply succeeded through an orderly transition that left no detailed record because none was needed. The funerary evidence associated with his name is fragmentary enough that even basic questions about his burial location remain genuinely contested among specialists. Some placing his tomb in the Theban region, others questioning whether the attributed object even belongs to this king at all, rather than a different, similarly named ruler, from the same crowded, confusing stretch of Egyptian history. The mainstream position treats this uncertainty as an unremarkable consequence of the period itself. The Second Intermediate Period, across nearly every chapter of this investigation, has shown us the same pattern. Fragmented sources, damaged king lists, kings whose reigns were too short or too regionally limited to generate the kind of extensive, durable record later, more stable dynasties left behind. Dedumose II's obscurity, in this view, isn't evidence of anything hidden. It's simply what happens to nearly every king from this era, a predictable casualty of chronic instability rather than a mystery demanding a dramatic explanation. But the specific confusion between Dedumose I and Dedumose II, two rulers who share not just a name but overlapping uncertainty about their exact place in history, has led some researchers to ask a more unsettling question. How much of what we currently attribute to Dedumose, across both proposed kings, might actually belong to a single individual, his fragmentary record split awkwardly across two identities by scholars working with incomplete evidence? If true, it would mean the very act of dividing these fragments into two separate reigns, an attempt to bring order to the confusion, may have introduced a new distortion of its own, manufacturing complexity rather than resolving it. Other Egyptologists push back firmly against this reading, citing genuine, if narrow, distinctions in the naming conventions and associated objects that support treating them as distinct rulers. The debate remains active, unresolved, argued in academic journals rather than settled in any textbook. What's left in the end is a king whose reign might have mattered enormously to Thebes' survival during its most precarious years, and whose basic biographical facts, how he lived, how he died, Where his body was ultimately laid to rest remain genuinely contested even among specialists who have spent careers studying this period. He exists for us less as a settled historical figure than as a set of open scholarly questions, each one dependent on how a handful of fragmentary objects are interpreted and cross-referenced against equally fragmentary king lists. Was Dedumose II a distinct, real king who helped steer Thebes through its darkest years before the War of Liberation? His story simply lost to time along with so much else from this fractured era? Or does his very existence, split confusingly from another king bearing his name, represent one more case where the tools historians use to bring order to ancient Egypt's chaos have, however unintentionally, created a mystery that reality itself may never have contained? We've already met Pepi II twice in this investigation, first as the excitable child king writing to Harkhuf about a dancing dwarf, and later as the aging father whose extraordinarily long reign left his son, Merenre II, inheriting a throne that may have already been too fragile to hold. Both stories touched in different ways on the same reign, one of the longest in recorded human history, a rule so extended that it likely reshaped the very structure of Egyptian power by its end. It's within this same reign, somewhere in its later, less documented decades, that a far more direct threat appears in the record. Not court intrigue, not succession uncertainty, but a named accusation of open rebellion. The evidence comes from the autobiography of a provincial official named Weni, inscribed in his tomb at Abydos, describing decades of loyal service under multiple pharaohs, including detailed accounts of military campaigns he led on behalf of the crown. Among these campaigns, Weni describes suppressing what he calls a rebellion, mobilizing forces to put down unrest that threatened royal authority. The inscription is proud, detailed in its description of troop movements and the geography of the campaign, exactly the kind of confident, self-glorifying military record Old Kingdom officials favored. And yet, in a pattern that should feel familiar by now, it never names the rebel it was written to defeat. This is a strange omission on its own terms. Egyptian triumph inscriptions typically thrived on specificity, precisely because naming a defeated enemy magnified the victor's achievement. A nameless uprising is a smaller boast than a named one. Weni had every rhetorical incentive to identify exactly who he'd crushed, if crushing a rival with a known identity and title would have made his own loyalty and competence look more impressive to whichever pharaoh eventually read or commissioned the inscription. Instead, the rebellion in Weni's account remains frustratingly abstract, described in terms of the threat it posed and the military response it required, but never anchored to an individual whose ambitions we could actually evaluate. Several explanations circulate among Egyptologists, none conclusively confirmed. The most straightforward reading treats this as ordinary provincial unrest, a local uprising significant enough to require military suppression, but not tied to any single prominent figure worth naming. Perhaps a coalition of disaffected officials or a regional uprising without one clear leader whose name would have meant anything to later readers of the inscription. Old Kingdom Egypt, even at the height of its stability under Pepi II, wasn't immune to friction between central authority and increasingly powerful regional governors, the same class of provincial nomarchs whose growing independence is often cited as a long-term contributor to the eventual collapse of centralized rule. In this reading, Weni's unnamed rebel isn't a mystery, so much as an unremarkable instance of exactly the kind of decentralizing pressure historians already understand this period to have experienced. But other historians have looked more closely at the timing and scale implied by Weni's account and wondered whether this suppressed rebellion reflects something closer to the center of power than ordinary provincial friction would suggest. Pepi II's reign, whatever its exact length, was long enough to have spanned multiple generations of court officials, regional governors, and quite possibly rival branches of the royal family itself, any of whom might have developed genuine ambitions for the throne as the king aged without any clear resolution to who would eventually succeed him. If the rebellion Weni suppressed originated from within this circle, rather than from a distant province, its absence from the official record becomes far more understandable and far more deliberate. A named royal relative or senior court official implicated in rebellion against a reigning pharaoh isn't the kind of detail Old Kingdom Egypt's carefully curated monumental record would have preserved willingly. The very institutions responsible for inscribing history had every reason to erase, rather than commemorate, an internal threat to the legitimacy of the throne itself. This theory finds some indirect support in the broader pattern we've already traced across Pepi II's reign and its aftermath. We know his extraordinarily long rule likely created succession pressures serious enough to leave his eventual heir, Merenre II, presiding over a kingdom already sliding toward collapse. We know the transition from Pepi II's reign into the First Intermediate Period was rapid and, by most accounts, genuinely destabilizing, in ways that suggest problems accumulating well before his death rather than emerging suddenly afterward. An unnamed rebellion, suppressed at some point during those long final decades, fits naturally into this picture of gradually eroding central authority, even if we can't say with certainty who led it or how close it came to succeeding. What survives, ultimately, is Weni's proud but incomplete account, a rebellion real enough to require military mobilization, and a redacted absence exactly where a name should be. Whether that absence reflects a minor, forgettable provincial disturbance, or a genuinely dangerous challenge to the throne itself, quietly erased by a court unwilling to memorialize its own vulnerability, is a question the inscription itself was never going to answer. Was the rebel Weni fought simply too insignificant to name, a footnote to decades of otherwise loyal service? Or does this silence conceal one of the earliest cracks in Old Kingdom Egypt's authority, a challenge to Pepi II's throne serious enough that even the officials who defeated it dared not write down whose ambition they had actually crushed? Centuries after Weni marched against an enemy he refused to name, Egypt would face a very different kind of silence. Not around a rebellion suppressed, but around a diplomatic relationship that seems, by every surviving trace, to have mattered enormously and then simply stopped being recorded at all. The evidence begins on Sihel Island, near the first cataract at Aswan, where a striking rock-cut inscription bears the name and titulary of Neferhotep Biyun, a 13th dynasty pharaoh whose reign, unusually for this chaotic period, left behind a genuinely substantial body of monuments. Statues bearing his name have been found not just in Egypt, but as far afield as Byblos on the Levantine coast, and even, remarkably, on Kerma in Nubia, evidence of a king whose reach and recognition extended well beyond the immediate boundaries of a fractured Nile valley. For a 13th dynasty ruler, a period we've already seen defined by kings ruling mere months with barely a scarab to their name, Neferhotep I stands out as someone who commanded real, sustained authority, someone other polities across the region apparently found worth acknowledging. This is what makes the specific gap in his record so puzzling. A stela from his reign references contact and apparent cooperation with rulers in Byblos, a Levantine port city that had maintained trade and diplomatic relationships with Egypt for centuries by this point, exchanging cedar wood, resins, and other Levantine goods for Egyptian products and, crucially, political legitimacy. Byblos's own rulers had a long tradition of adopting Egyptian royal symbols and titles to bolster their standing, a relationship of genuine mutual benefit. Neferhotep III's presence there, commemorated enough to leave physical evidence, suggests this relationship remained active and meaningful even as Central Egyptian authority elsewhere was fracturing. And yet the actual content of that relationship, what was negotiated, what was exchanged, what obligations or alliances it may have created, is almost entirely absent from the record. We have proof of contact without any account of what the contact accomplished. Compare this to earlier, better documented periods of Egyptian foreign relations, where treaties, trade agreements, and diplomatic correspondence, however fragmentary, at least gesture toward the substance of these relationships. With Neferhotep II, we're left holding evidence of reach without evidence of purpose, monuments proving he mattered to distant rulers without any text explaining why. The Nubian evidence deepens this same puzzle rather than resolving it. Objects bearing Neferhotep II's name, found near Kerma, then an increasingly powerful Nubian kingdom in its own right, and not simply a passive recipient of Egyptian influence, raise real questions about the nature of the relationship between 13th Dynasty Egypt and this southern power. Was this evidence of Egyptian authority still being respected and enforced this far south, decades into a period of fragmenting central control? Or does it reflect something closer to diplomatic outreach between two increasingly comparable powers? An acknowledgement from a weakened Egyptian court that Kerma could no longer simply be commanded, only courted. The physical objects alone can't distinguish between these possibilities, and no accompanying text survives to settle the question either way. Mainstream Egyptology tends to treat Neferhotep I's extensive but thinly documented foreign contacts as consistent with what we'd expect from an unusually capable king operating during a genuinely difficult period. Even as 13th Dynasty central authority weakened at home, a strong individual ruler could still project influence abroad through personal prestige, established trade networks, and existing diplomatic relationships built up over generations rather than newly constructed during his own reign. In this reading, the absence of detailed diplomatic records isn't evidence of anything concealed. It simply reflects the reality that Old and Middle Kingdom Egyptian foreign policy, even at its most active, rarely generated the kind of detailed treaty documentation that later periods, particularly the New Kingdom's more extensive international correspondence, would eventually produce. But the specific breadth of Neferhotep I's reach, spanning from Nubia to the Levantine coast, during a period when Egypt's internal cohesion was genuinely fragile, has led some researchers to propose a more active diplomatic strategy behind these scattered monuments. That Neferhotep may have been deliberately cultivating alliances or prestige relationships specifically to compensate for weakening domestic authority, using recognition abroad to shore up legitimacy at home in ways the internal Egyptian record, focused on succession and central administration, simply wasn't structured to capture. If true, this would mean Neferhotep III's foreign relationships weren't peripheral to his reign, but potentially central to how he maintained power at all, a diplomatic strategy sophisticated enough to leave physical traces across multiple regions while somehow leaving almost no explanatory text behind anywhere. Others have wondered whether the relationship with Byblos specifically hints at something beyond ordinary trade, whether the political turbulence Byblos itself experienced during this broader period might have created opportunities, or obligations, that drew Neferhotep I into regional politics more directly than a typical Egyptian pharaoh of this era would have been. What remains, across the scattered stones bearing his name from Nubia to the Levant, is proof of a king whose influence traveled further than almost any of his 13th Dynasty contemporaries, and an almost complete silence about what that influence actually secured him, or cost him in return. Did Neferhotep II maintain these distant relationships through nothing more than the ordinary continuation of long-established trade, requiring no special explanation beyond his own evident competence? Or do these scattered monuments mark the edges of a genuinely ambitious foreign policy, one whose true shape and purpose Egypt's surviving records were simply never designed to preserve? Imagine the scratch of a reed pen against papyrus in a scribal office at Thebes, sometime near the very end of the New Kingdom, recording military orders in a hand more accustomed to administrative routine than crisis. What survives from that office is a collection of documents known as the Late Ramesside Letters, correspondence involving a man whose title alone should place him firmly within the traditional hierarchy of Egyptian power, and whose actual behavior, preserved in his own letters, suggests something considerably stranger was underway. General Piankh held the position of High Priest of Amun at Thebes during the twilight years of the 20th Dynasty, a period when the office of High Priest had already begun accumulating an extraordinary degree of civil and military authority alongside its religious duties. This alone wasn't unprecedented. Theban high priests had been gaining influence for generations as the New Kingdom's central authority weakened. What sets Piankh apart is the specific content of his surviving correspondence. Letters that reveal a man conducting his own military campaigns, managing grain shipments, and issuing orders with an independence that reads less like a devoted servant of a distant pharaoh and more like a regional ruler operating on his own authority. The most striking evidence comes from Piankh's letters concerning a campaign in Nubia undertaken during a period when Ramesses XIII, the last king of the 20th dynasty, technically still occupied the Egyptian throne. In these letters, Piankh discusses military operations, troop movements, and matters of state with barely a passing acknowledgement of royal authority at all. Some interpretations of the correspondence suggest he may have been operating with the king's explicit sanction, a trusted general handling southern affairs precisely because the king himself lacked the resources or stability to manage them directly. Other readings find the letters conspicuously light on any language of deference or reporting upward that we'd expect from a loyal official managing the king's business rather than his own. Then there's a detail that has fascinated Egyptologists for decades. A fragmentary reference, within these same letters, to violence involving a figure whose exact identity remains unclear, sometimes interpreted as an internal power struggle, possibly even implicating members of Piankh's own household or administration in some kind of conflict whose full details the surviving text never spells out. What exactly happened, who was involved, and what it meant for the balance of power at Thebes during these final Ramesside years remains genuinely contested, the letters offering just enough detail to confirm something significant occurred without offering enough to reconstruct it fully. This is where Piankh's career intersects with one of the most consequential transitions in ancient Egyptian history, the beginning of what scholars call the repetition of Egypt, or more commonly the start of Egypt's division between a nominally unified kingship in the north and effective priestly rule at Thebes in the south, a split that would define the coming Third Intermediate Period. Piankh died, by most reconstructions, while Ramesses IX was still nominally reigning, meaning he never lived to see the full formal separation of powers that his successors as High Priest of Amun, particularly Herihor and later Pinigem I, would eventually preside over. But his letters, read in light of what came after, look less like the correspondence of a loyal general and more like an early draft of the independent quasi-royal authority Theban high priests would soon openly claim for themselves. The mainstream historical view treats Piankh as a transitional figure, operating within a genuinely chaotic period when Egypt's traditional center of power had weakened enough that a capable, well-positioned general and high priest could accumulate authority far beyond his formal title without necessarily intending outright usurpation. In this reading, Piankh wasn't defying the king so much as filling a vacuum the king's own weakened position had created, managing Upper Egypt's military and administrative needs because someone had to, and because Thebes' traditional religious authority gave him the standing to do so without triggering the kind of direct confrontation open rebellion would have caused. But the specific tone of his letters, that persistent absence of deferential language toward the throne, combined with the unresolved violence hinted at within his own administration, has led some historians to a more pointed question. Was Piankh already functioning, in practice, if not in formal title, as an independent ruler of Upper Egypt well before his successors made that independence official? If so, the traditional narrative of a gradual, almost accidental drift toward Egypt's division may need revision, replaced by a picture where the fracture was already substantially underway, deliberately constructed by an ambitious high priest during the final years of a Ramesside king too weak to prevent it. What we're left with, ultimately, is a set of letters that speak with unusual directness about military and administrative matters, and unusual silence about the internal conflict and true scope of ambition they only partially reveal. Piankh's own death left these questions unresolved for his successors to inherit, along with whatever authority, formal or otherwise, he had already accumulated at Thebes. Did Piankh serve faithfully within a crumbling system, simply doing what circumstance required of the man closest to real power in a leaderless South? Or was he already the architect of Egypt's coming division, a general and high priest who understood before anyone else dared write it down that the age of a single unquestioned pharaoh ruling the entire Nile was quietly coming to an end? That same question, whether a title reflects real power or merely papers over its absence, reaches back far earlier than Piankh's Thebes into the crowded, fractured succession of the 17th Dynasty, where a king named Sekhemre Sankhtawy Neferhotep III presents a puzzle of a different but strangely familiar kind. A pharaoh whose formal claim to the throne is beyond dispute, and whose actual reign is almost impossible to reconstruct with any confidence at all. The evidence for Neferhotep III rests on a stela, damaged but legible enough to preserve his full royal titulary, discovered among the fragmentary records historians have painstakingly assembled to reconstruct the 17th dynasty's sequence of Theban kings. This was the same turbulent line that would eventually produce Sekhemre and his sons, the kings who launched the war against the Hyksos that Ahmose the Firmers would finally complete. Neferhotep III appears to belong somewhere in this sequence, a legitimate Theban pharaoh during the kingdom's fight for survival against northern domination. But where he belongs exactly, how long he reigned, and what specifically he accomplished during that reign remain questions the surviving stela simply wasn't detailed enough to answer. This is a familiar problem by now in this investigation, another 17th dynasty king whose brief and thinly documented reign leaves more questions than answers. But Neferhotep III's case carries a specific wrinkle that sets it apart. His throne name, Sekhemre Sankhtawy, translates roughly to "powerful is Re, who causes the two lands to live," a name asserting exactly the kind of restorative, unifying kingship Thebes desperately needed during this period of resistance against the Hyksos. Royal throne names in ancient Egypt were rarely chosen casually. They functioned as declarations of a king's intended legacy and ideological program. A name this specifically tied to restoring and sustaining a divided Egypt suggests Neferhotep III, or the court that crowned him, wanted to project exactly the image of a unifying, effective ruler that Thebes' ongoing conflict demanded. And yet nothing in the surviving physical record confirms whether he ever had the chance, or the capability, to live up to that name. No military inscriptions survive describing campaigns he led against the Hyksos. No building projects have been confidently attributed to his reign. We have, in essence, a king who arrived making an ambitious promise, preserved for us in the very words of his throne name, and almost total silence about whether that promise was kept, attempted, or abandoned before it could even begin. The straightforward explanation, consistent with nearly everything we've already learned about the 17th dynasty's chaotic internal politics, is that Neferhotep III simply reigned too briefly to accomplish much of anything, another name in a rapid, unstable succession where royal ambition regularly outpaced the time or resources available to fulfill it. Choosing an aspirational throne name cost nothing and required no actual military success, and Egyptian kings throughout history sometimes claimed grand titles their reigns never came close to justifying. In this reading, Neferhotep III isn't a mystery demanding special explanation. He's simply further confirmation of a pattern we've traced repeatedly throughout this fractured dynasty. Ambition documented in stone, achievement lost to time, if it happened at all. But some historians have pushed further, wondering whether Neferhotep III's placement within the 17th dynasty sequence might actually matter more than his brief, undocumented reign initially suggests. If he ruled during a specific window of the resistance against the Hyksos, perhaps in a lull between more famous, better documented military campaigns led by other kings in this same dynasty, his reign might represent a moment of consolidation or preparation rather than failure. A king whose contribution was administrative or diplomatic rather than martial, the unglamorous groundwork that made later, more celebrated victories possible, but which left behind none of the triumphant inscriptions that secure a king's place in popular memory. Consolidation rarely gets carved into monuments the way conquest does. Others have focused on the throne name itself, wondering whether its specific emphasis on sustaining the two lands, a phrase inherently referencing the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, hints at a king who saw his role explicitly in terms of the broader war effort against Hyksos control of the north, rather than as a general aspiration common to many pharaohs. If Neferhotep III genuinely understood his reign in these terms, his apparent lack of military accomplishment becomes more puzzling rather than less. A king whose stated purpose and actual historical footprint sit in unexplained tension with one another. What survives in the end is a single damaged stela, carrying an ambitious name and a legitimate royal title, and almost nothing else to tell us whether the king behind that name and title ever had the chance to become what he claimed he would be. somewhere in the gap between 17th Dynasty Thebes' desperate need for unifying leadership and the historical silence surrounding this particular king lies a reign we can barely reconstruct. Did Neferhotep III's promise of restoring the two lands go untested, cut short before he could attempt anything the historical record would remember? Or did he quietly do exactly what his name proclaimed, laying groundwork for a war effort whose eventual victory would be credited entirely to the kings who came after him? That single damaged stela, carrying an ambitious throne name and little else, has a counterpart further north, at Saqqara, where a genuine pyramid, small and largely ruined but unmistakably a king's funerary monument, raises a very different kind of question. Here, the mystery isn't whether a king accomplished what he claimed. It's a question more basic still. Who, exactly, was he to begin with? The pyramid belongs to a 13th dynasty pharaoh named Khendjer, and it stands as one of the last royal pyramids ever constructed in ancient Egypt, a fading echo of the grand mortuary tradition that had defined Egyptian kingship for well over 1,000 years by this point. That alone makes it significant. But what has fascinated Egyptologists for decades isn't primarily the structure itself, modest and badly damaged as it now is. It's the king's name, Khendjer, which stands out immediately as unusual among Egyptian royal titulary. Unlike the vast majority of pharaonic names which drew on traditional Egyptian religious and linguistic conventions, Khendjer appears to derive from a Semitic word meaning boar, a striking linguistic outlier for a man who nonetheless held the full formal titulary of a legitimate Egyptian king, complete with the traditional throne name and epithets any pharaoh would have claimed. This single detail has driven a genuine, ongoing debate about Khendjer's origins. Was he an Egyptian by birth who simply carried an unusual, foreign-derived birth name, perhaps reflecting a Semitic-speaking ancestor or regional naming trend from the Eastern Delta, or another area with close contact to Levantine populations? Or does his name suggest something more significant? An official or military figure of genuinely foreign background who rose, through means the record doesn't specify, to occupy the Egyptian throne itself during the 13th dynasty's already fractured and rapidly shifting succession? This question matters more than it might first appear, because the 13th dynasty occupies a particularly sensitive position in Egyptian history, immediately preceding the more famous and better documented rise of the Hyksos, foreign rulers of Levantine origin who would eventually control the Delta and parts of Middle Egypt entirely. If Khendjer's name does reflect genuine foreign origin, he would represent something historically significant in his own right. Evidence that individuals of Semitic background could, and did, ascend to the very highest office in Egyptian society well before the Hyksos period is traditionally understood to have begun, achieving full legitimate kingship rather than simply regional or delta-based authority. This would complicate the standard historical narrative that treats foreign rule in Egypt as something that arrived relatively abruptly with Hyksos political dominance, suggesting instead a longer, more gradual pattern of integration and advancement within Egyptian institutions themselves. The mainstream, more cautious position notes that names alone are an imperfect guide to actual ethnic or cultural identity, particularly in a period and region with centuries of established contact, trade, and population movement between Egypt and the Levant. A Semitic-derived name doesn't necessarily indicate a first-generation immigrant or someone raised outside Egyptian culture entirely. It could simply reflect a family with mixed heritage or regional naming customs, several generations removed from any direct foreign connection, fully Egyptian in language, religion, and administrative training, despite an unusual name. Egypt's Eastern Delta, in particular, had long served as a zone of cultural mixing, and there's nothing inherently implausible about an Egyptian court, even a royal one, including individuals whose names reflected this broader regional heritage, without that heritage defining their actual identity or loyalties in any meaningful sense. But the specific context of Khendjer's rise adds another layer worth considering. Some evidence suggests he may not have inherited the throne through conventional royal succession at all, but rose from a non-royal background, possibly through military or administrative service, a pattern not entirely unprecedented in 13th Dynasty Egypt's increasingly fluid and unstable succession, but unusual enough to invite scrutiny when combined with his unusual name. If Khendjer really did rise from outside the traditional royal family, through ability or opportunity rather than birthright, his case would represent a genuinely interesting window into how fluid and how vulnerable to disruption Egyptian kingship had become by this point in its history, an office still commanding immense ideological authority, even as the practical mechanisms determining who actually held it grew increasingly unstable and, perhaps, increasingly open to outsiders willing and able to seize the opportunity. Some researchers have gone further, connecting Khendjer's uncertain origins to the broader pattern of Semitic-speaking populations already settling in the eastern delta during this period, populations whose growing presence and influence would, within a matter of generations, provide much of the foundation for Hyksos political dominance itself. In this reading, Khendjer wouldn't be a strange anomaly so much as an early individual data point within a much larger demographic and political shift already quietly reshaping Egyptian society well before anyone would have recognized it as the beginning of a new era. What remains at Saqqara is a small damaged pyramid, one of the last of its kind ever built, belonging to a king whose full formal Egyptian titulary sits uneasily alongside a name that almost certainly wasn't native Egyptian in origin. The stone confirms he ruled. It says nothing about where he came from, or how a name meaning boar came to be carved beside the traditional throne names of pharaohs stretching back more than 1,000 years before him. Was Khendjer simply an Egyptian official whose family name happened to reflect the region's long history of cultural mixing, ruling as fully and legitimately Egyptian as any king before him? Or does his pyramid mark something historians are still working to fully understand? An early sign that Egypt's throne, even at its most traditionally sacred, had already become more permeable to outside origins than the official record was ever inclined to admit. That question, how permeable Egypt's institutions really were to figures whose backgrounds don't fit the official narrative, resurfaces again in a different form, this time not at the level of kingship itself, but one step below the throne, in the record of a man who apparently held one of the most powerful administrative offices in the land, and then vanished from that record almost entirely. In a private tomb chapel in the Theban necropolis, badly damaged by later reuse and centuries of exposure, fragments of wall decoration preserve the name and title of a man identified as Nebamun, described in the surviving inscriptions as Chancellor, one of the most significant offices in the Egyptian administrative hierarchy, a position responsible for overseeing treasury operations, royal building projects, and substantial portions of the kingdom's economic machinery. The title alone tells us this was a man who, at some point, stood extremely close to the center of power, trusted with responsibilities that touched nearly every functioning part of the state. And yet the same fragmentary walls that preserve his title offer almost nothing else. No clear indication of which pharaoh he served under with full certainty, no detailed account of his specific accomplishments, and no explanation for why a man of this rank appears so briefly and so incompletely in the broader administrative record of his era. This is, on its surface, a familiar pattern by now in this investigation. Another Egyptian official whose life has been reduced to fragments by the simple erosion of time. But Nebamun's case carries a specific texture of strangeness that sets it apart from ordinary loss. Chancellors, by the nature of their office, tended to leave behind unusually extensive administrative footprints, their names appearing on tax records, building inscriptions, seal impressions, and the correspondence of the officials who worked beneath them, precisely because their responsibilities touch so many different areas of government function simultaneously. A high priest might be remembered primarily through religious monuments. A general might be remembered through military inscriptions. A chancellor, by contrast, typically left traces scattered across nearly the entire administrative apparatus of the state, simply because his office required it. Nebamun's near-total absence from this kind of scattered, redundant record, beyond the single damaged tomb chapel bearing his name and title, is what makes his case genuinely puzzling, rather than simply another casualty of time's ordinary erosion. The tomb itself offers a further complication. Portions of its decoration appear to have been deliberately damaged, the kind of targeted destruction Egyptologists sometimes associate with a practice known as damnatio memoriae, a term borrowed from later Roman history but applied usefully to ancient Egypt's own long tradition of erasing the names and images of individuals who had fallen from official favor, been implicated in disgrace, or found themselves on the losing side of a political transition their successors had no interest in memorializing. This kind of damage is difficult to attribute with total certainty. Tombs across Thebes suffered from later reuse, quarrying for building material, and simple weathering that can mimic the appearance of deliberate destruction in ways that are genuinely hard to distinguish without careful, close examination. But where such damage does appear intentional in Nebamun's tomb, concentrated specifically around cartouches or name inscriptions rather than distributed evenly across the chapel's decorated surfaces, it raises a pointed question. Was this ordinary decay? Or was someone, at some point after Nebamun's death, actively working to remove him from the record his own office should have made nearly impossible to erase? If deliberate erasure is the correct explanation, it would place Nebamun within a very specific category of Egyptian historical figures, officials whose fall from grace was significant enough to warrant active suppression rather than simple neglect. Egyptian history offers real precedent for this kind of targeted erasure, most famously in the treatment of certain New Kingdom figures whose names and images were later chiseled away from monuments by political rivals or successors eager to distance themselves from an association, a policy, or a religious movement that had fallen out of favor. If Nebamun suffered a similar fate, the obvious question becomes what he could have done, as Chancellor, to warrant this kind of treatment. Financial corruption serious enough to threaten the stability of the treasury he oversaw, political entanglement with a faction or succession dispute that ended badly for him and everyone associated with his name, or something more specific still, tied to a building project, a religious policy, or a diplomatic failure that history has simply lost the specific details of, along with the man himself. The more cautious, mainstream explanation resists reaching for scandal, where ordinary loss can account for the evidence just as well. Tombs across the Theban necropolis were frequently reused across later centuries, their original decoration damaged, plastered over, or repurposed by subsequent occupants with no connection to, or animosity toward, the tomb's original owner. Administrative records from Egyptian history, however extensive they may have been at the time, survive today only in the fraction that happened to be preserved by fortunate circumstances, whether buried in dry sand, sealed within undisturbed structures, or simply overlooked by the generations of quarrying, flooding, and urban development that destroyed so much of what once existed. A chancellor's administrative footprint, however theoretically extensive, was still vulnerable to exactly this kind of ordinary undramatic loss. In this reading, Nebamun's near-total absence from the broader record isn't evidence of deliberate suppression at all. It's simply what happens when a genuinely significant historical footprint meets several thousand years of accumulated destruction. No scandal required to explain a silence that time alone was fully capable of producing. But the specific concentration of damage around his name, if confirmed through careful study rather than assumed from a first impression, would be difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. Some Egyptologists working on badly preserved Theban tombs have noted that ordinary weathering tends to damage decorated surfaces relatively evenly, following patterns of water infiltration, structural collapse, or general environmental exposure that don't typically single out cartouches and name inscriptions with any particular precision. Deliberate erasure, by contrast, often shows exactly this kind of targeted pattern. Chisel marks concentrated specifically where a name or image once appeared, while the surrounding decorative elements remain comparatively intact. Distinguishing between these two possibilities requires close physical examination of the actual damage, work that, for many partially studied tombs in the vast Theban necropolis, simply hasn't been completed with the level of detail that would settle the question definitively. This uncertainty has left room for a range of speculation about what, specifically, might have happened to Nebamun. Some researchers have wondered whether his fall, if it occurred, was connected to broader court politics, of a kind we've already seen recur throughout this investigation: succession disputes, factional rivalries between competing officials, or entanglement with a pharaoh whose own reign ended in circumstances significant enough to implicate the officials most closely associated with him. Others have proposed more specific, though entirely unconfirmed, theories involving financial mismanagement, the kind of scandal that would have been genuinely dangerous for a chancellor specifically, given his direct oversight of treasury operations and royal economic policy, precisely the area where accusations of corruption or incompetence could most directly threaten a king's confidence and, by extension, an official's continued survival in office. None of these theories currently rest on direct evidence tied specifically to Nebamun beyond the ambiguous damage to his tomb and the broader absence of corroborating administrative material. They remain, for now, informed speculation built around a genuinely unusual gap in the record, rather than conclusions supported by confirmed documentation. What survives, in the end, is a badly damaged tomb chapel, a title substantial enough to demand a far more extensive historical footprint than the one we actually have, and damage patterns that may, or may not, represent deliberate erasure rather than the ordinary accumulated toll of several thousand years. Nebamun held, at least briefly, one of the most powerful offices in ancient Egyptian government. Whatever came after that, the fall from favor, the quiet retirement, the ordinary death followed by nothing more than time's indifferent erosion, has left behind a silence specific enough to invite real scrutiny, and thin enough that scrutiny alone may never be able to resolve it. Was Chancellor Nebamun simply another casualty of the Theban necropolis's long, destructive history, his extensive administrative footprint lost along with countless other records that fortune alone determined would not survive? Or does the pattern of damage concentrated around his own name mark something more deliberate, evidence of a fall from power significant enough that someone, once, worked specifically to make sure his name would not be the one remembered? Where Nebamun's tomb offers us only fragments and ambiguous damage, one Theban tomb from a slightly earlier period stands as almost the opposite case entirely. Among the best preserved, most extensively decorated, and most thoroughly inscribed private tombs to survive from the entire New Kingdom. This is the tomb of Rekhmire, Vizier under two pharaohs of the 18th Dynasty, Thutmose III and briefly Amenhotep II, and it contains something remarkable, a text so detailed and so specific that Egyptologists still treat it as one of the single most important sources for understanding how the Egyptian government actually functioned in practice. Known as the installation of the Vizier, this inscription lays out, in extraordinary procedural detail, the duties, responsibilities, and ethical obligations of the office Rekhmire held, essentially a job description preserved in stone for the second most powerful position in the entire Egyptian state. This is what makes what happened at the end of Rekhmire's life so genuinely strange. A man this thoroughly documented, whose tomb preserves not just his titles and achievements, but the actual administrative philosophy of his office, simply disappears from the official record before his tomb decoration was ever completed. Sections of the tomb remain visibly unfinished, outline sketches never filled in with color, certain scenes abandoned partway through their execution, and more tellingly still, no inscription anywhere in the tomb, or anywhere else in the surviving record, mentions his death, his burial, or any successor stepping into the vizierate specifically because Rekhmire's own tenure had ended. He simply stops appearing in administrative records that, up to a certain point, had documented his activities with real consistency. For context, it helps to understand just how significant the Vizier's office actually was. The installation text itself describes the Vizier as the figure standing closest to the king in daily governance, responsible for overseeing the judiciary, tax collection, and the administration of the entire country's civil bureaucracy, a position of such consequence that the inscription explicitly warns against corruption, favoritism, and the abuse of power, framing the Vizier's integrity as essential to the kingdom's proper functioning. This wasn't a minor court role that might reasonably fade from the record through simple obscurity. This was, functionally, the head of Egypt's civil government, a position whose holder's activities should have generated exactly the kind of extensive administrative footprint we discussed in Nebamun's case, if not more so, given the vizier's direct involvement in nearly every judicial and economic matter the state processed. And yet the ending of Rekhmire's career offers almost nothing. Unlike Nebamun, there's no visible evidence of deliberate erasure here, no chisel marks concentrated suspiciously around his name or image. The tomb, despite its unfinished state, appears to have been left that way through simple incompletion rather than active destruction. This is, in some ways, a more unsettling kind of silence than deliberate erasure would be. Erasure at least implies someone cared enough about Rekhmire's fall to act on it, a scandal significant enough to warrant the effort of physically removing his name. An unfinished tomb and a quietly ended administrative record suggest something closer to abandonment, as though Rekhmire's departure from office happened too suddenly or too quietly for anyone, including perhaps Rekhmire himself, to properly close out the record his own status should have demanded. The most straightforward explanation offered by mainstream Egyptology points to natural causes combined with unfortunate timing. Tomb decoration in ancient Egypt was frequently completed gradually, sometimes over years or even decades, and it wasn't unusual for a tomb owner to die before the full decorative program was finished, particularly if death came without warning rather than following a lengthy illness that might have prompted his family or successors to prioritize completing the work. If Rekhmire died relatively suddenly, perhaps during the political transition between Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, a period when court priorities and available resources may have shifted rapidly enough that his tomb simply lost its claim on the workshops and artisans needed to finish it, an unfinished monument and a quietly ended record become considerably less mysterious. Court attention moves on, resources get redirected toward a new king's priorities. A vizier's unfinished tomb, however significant the man himself had been, may simply have fallen victim to the ordinary, undramatic reality of a royal transition's shifting focus. But the specific timing here invites closer scrutiny than this explanation alone comfortably resolves. The transition from Thutmose III to Amenhotep II wasn't an entirely smooth, uneventful handover. Like many royal successions throughout Egyptian history, it involved the practical challenges of a new king establishing his own authority, potentially reshuffling key administrative positions to ensure loyalty from officials who had served his father, rather than assuming their continued cooperation. Some historians have wondered whether Rekhmire's abrupt disappearance from the record reflects not simply an unfortunately timed natural death, but a more pointed political reality. That Amenhotep II, upon taking the throne, may have moved to replace or sideline officials too closely associated with his father's administration, Rekhmire potentially among them, in favor of a new vizier whose loyalty was owed more directly to the new king himself. If true, this wouldn't necessarily mean Rekhmire was disgraced in the dramatic sense implied by deliberate tomb erasure elsewhere in Egyptian history. It might mean something quieter, but no less consequential. A forced retirement, a loss of royal favor significant enough to end his tenure, and, with it, any court-sponsored effort to complete a tomb for a man no longer considered worth the investment. Other researchers have focused less on political explanation and more on what the unfinished state of the tomb itself might reveal about Rekhmire's actual standing at the moment of his death, wondering whether the specific sections left incomplete, rather than being random or simply the last portions scheduled for work, correspond to areas of the tomb that would have depicted his relationship with Amenhotep II specifically, as opposed to the already completed sections documenting his service under Thutmose III. If certain scenes were deliberately left unfinished rather than simply unstarted, it could suggest the transition between kings created genuine uncertainty about how, or whether, to visually represent Rekhmire's continued relevance under a new pharaoh, an artistic and political problem that may never have been resolved before his tomb and his career were quietly abandoned. What we're left with, in the end, is one of ancient Egypt's most administratively significant texts, preserved in extraordinary detail within a tomb that itself trails off into silence and incompletion at precisely the point where we'd most want clarity. Rekhmire told us, through his own inscription, exactly what a vizier was supposed to be and do. He never told us, because he couldn't, or because no one after him thought to record it, exactly how his own distinguished tenure in that office actually came to its end. Did Rekhmire's celebrated career end simply through the ordinary misfortune of dying at an inconvenient political moment? His unfinished tomb a casualty of shifting royal priorities rather than personal disgrace? Or does the specific targeted incompleteness of his tomb's decoration mark something closer to a quiet fall from favor? A vizier whose service to one king became a liability under the next, erased not through violent chisel marks but through the simpler and perhaps more telling act of simply choosing not to finish the story at all. Leave Thebes now and travel north along the Nile to a stretch of desert cliffs the ancient Egyptians never intended to become a capital at all. Akhenaten, known today as Amarna, the short-lived city built by Akhenaten as the center of his radical religious revolution, dedicated exclusively to the worship of the sun disk, Aten. Carved into the northern tombs cut into these cliffs, reserved for the officials closest to the heretic king himself, is one of the most detailed and visually striking tombs at the entire site, belonging to a man whose title alone marks him as central to Akhenaten's security and control over this experimental new capital. Mahu, chief of Medjay, commander of the police and security forces responsible for protecting the king, the royal family, and the city itself. The Medjay, originally a term referring to Nubian peoples who had long served in Egyptian military and policing roles, had by the new kingdom become less an ethnic designation and more a functional title, referring broadly to the paramilitary police forces tasked with maintaining order, guarding royal installations, and patrolling Egypt's borders and desert routes. As chief of Medjay at Amarna specifically, Mahu would have held direct responsibility for the physical security of Akhenaten's entire religious and political project, a role of genuine consequence given how deeply unpopular the king's abandonment of Egypt's traditional pantheon in favor of exclusive Aten worship seems to have been among significant portions of the traditional priesthood and quite possibly the broader population as well. Mahu's tomb decoration reflects this responsibility vividly. Its scenes depict him actively engaged in his duties, overseeing patrols, presenting captured wrongdoers for judgment, and participating directly in the ceremonial and practical life of Akhenaten's court in ways that suggest a man genuinely close to the center of power during Amarna's brief, intense existence. This wasn't a peripheral administrative figure. Mahu's position placed him at the heart of one of ancient Egypt's most turbulent religious and political experiments, responsible for protecting a king whose policies had alienated the traditional priesthood at Thebes and whose eventual failure following his death would trigger a swift and thorough reversal of nearly everything he'd tried to build. And this is precisely where Mahu's own story becomes difficult to follow. Unlike Rekhmire, whose tomb was left visibly unfinished, or Nebamun, whose tomb shows possible signs of deliberate damage, Mahu's tomb at Amarna appears to have been essentially complete, a genuinely impressive monument by the standards of the officials buried there. But it was also, like every other tomb at Amarna, never used. When Akhenaten died and the royal court abandoned the city entirely within a matter of years, relocating back toward Thebes and Memphis under his eventual successors, the elaborate tombs cut into Amarna's cliffs for the king's inner circle were left empty, their intended occupants presumably buried elsewhere, if they were buried with any ceremony at all, in locations that have never been definitively identified. This means Mahu, despite commanding one of the most detailed and personally revealing tombs to survive from the entire Amarna period, has no confirmed burial anywhere. We know in vivid visual detail what his job looked like day to day at the height of Akhenaten's reign. We have no idea what happened to him once that reign ended, whether he died before the city's abandonment and was hastily reburied elsewhere, survived the transition and continued serving in some capacity under Akhenaten's immediate successors, Seankhibre or Tutankhamun, or simply disappeared into the chaos of a court in the midst of one of the most significant religious reversals in Egyptian history. His fate no more recorded than the countless other officials whose careers were built entirely around a project that Egypt's subsequent rulers worked hard to erase from memory. The most direct explanation ties Mahu's uncertain fate to the broader, well-documented pattern of Amarna's collapse. When Akhenaten's religious revolution ended, whether through his own death or the political maneuvering of officials and priests eager to restore traditional worship, the court's abandonment of the city was neither slow nor gentle. Within a relatively short period, Amarna was largely deserted, its monuments left to decay, and later kings, particularly during the reign of Horemheb, actively worked to dismantle and erase much of what Akhenaten had built, reusing his monuments as building material and working to remove his name and memory from official records wherever possible. Officials closely associated with the Amarna project, even those like Mahu, who may have simply been doing their assigned duty rather than architects of the religious policy itself, would have found themselves in a genuinely precarious position once the political winds shifted so completely. In this reading, Mahu's disappearance from the record isn't necessarily sinister. It reflects the practical reality facing anyone whose entire career had been built around a capital city and a religious project that Egypt's subsequent rulers had every institutional incentive to forget as thoroughly and quickly as possible. But the specific role Mahu held complicates this straightforward reading in ways worth sitting with. As chief of Medjay, he wasn't simply an administrator whose career happened to be tied to an unpopular religious policy. He was the man directly responsible for security and enforcement within a city whose very existence represented to many traditional Egyptians a genuine religious crisis, potentially placing him in direct opposition to individuals and factions who would have wielded considerably more influence once Akhenaten's project collapsed, and traditional worship, along with the priesthood that administered it, was restored to its former prominence. Did Mahu's specific responsibilities, enforcing order and possibly suppressing dissent during Akhenaten's reign, make him a particular target once that reign ended? Someone whose actions during the Amarna period were remembered specifically and unfavorably by whoever emerged with power in the restoration that followed? Or did his purely administrative, security-focused role, as opposed to religious or ideological leadership, actually protect him, allowing him to simply transition into a similar security position under subsequent, more traditionally aligned pharaohs without the same scrutiny applied to figures more directly associated with Atenist religious doctrine itself? Some researchers have speculated about the specific mechanics of what happened to officials like Mahu during Amarna's abandonment, wondering whether hasty, poorly documented reburials took place. Official bodies moved from the city's cliff tombs to locations closer to Thebes as the court relocated, a process during which records could easily have been lost, particularly for a period when the ruling administration had little interest in carefully preserving documentation connected to a religious experiment it was actively trying to erase. Others have wondered whether Mahu, given his security expertise, may have found continued value to the state regardless of the religious reversal underway. His practical skills useful enough to ensure his survival and continued employment, even as the ideological project he'd once protected was being systematically dismantled around him. What remains, cut into the desert cliffs above an abandoned city, is one of the most vivid surviving portraits of daily official life during Akhenaten's reign, a tomb prepared with real care and detail for a man who never actually occupied it. Mahu's duties, his proximity to power, his direct role in one of Egyptian history's most dramatic religious upheavals. All of this survives in stone. What became of him personally, once the city he protected was left to the desert, does not. Did Mahu die honorably in service to a king whose religious revolution ultimately failed, his body reburied in some now unknown location once Amarna's court abandoned the city he'd sworn to protect? Or did his specific role enforcing order during Akhenaten's reign make him a casualty of the restoration that followed? One more name quietly lost when Egypt worked so hard to make sure the Amarna period, and everyone closely associated with it, would be forgotten as completely as the traditional religion it had briefly displaced. Long before Amarna's brief religious revolution, and even before the Second Intermediate Period's crowded, chaotic succession of kings we've already spent so much time untangling, the early 13th dynasty produced a pharaoh whose surviving evidence presents its own distinct kind of puzzle, one located less in dramatic disappearance and more in the sheer difficulty of establishing basic facts about who he actually was. Seankhibre Amenemhat appears in the fragmentary Terrene king list among the early rulers of the 13th dynasty, a period we've returned to repeatedly throughout this investigation precisely because it generated so many short, thinly documented reigns. But Amenemhat's case carries a specific complication worth pausing on. His name itself, combining elements that suggest a connection to the powerful Antef family name associated with earlier 11th dynasty rulers, raises genuine questions about whether he represented a continuation of established royal lineage, a deliberate invocation of that lineage's prestige by a ruler with no direct blood connection to it, or something else entirely. A coincidence of naming convention that modern historians have perhaps read too much significance into. The evidence for his reign is not entirely absent, which is itself notable given how many 13th dynasty kings we've encountered leave us almost nothing beyond a name on a damaged list. A small number of objects, including seal impressions and at least one inscribed monument, carry his name and confirm a genuine functioning reign, rather than a purely theoretical entry in a chronicle compiled generations later. This puts Amenemhat in a slightly stronger evidentiary position than kings like Neferkare 7, whose existence rested almost entirely on the king list alone. But the specific content of what these objects tell us remains frustratingly thin, confirming that he ruled without offering much insight into how long, how effectively, or under what specific circumstances his reign began and ended. The naming question deserves particular attention, because it touches on something larger than just this one king's individual biography. The 11th dynasty's Antef kings had been significant figures in Egyptian history, ruling from Thebes during the process of reunification that ended the first intermediate period, their name carrying real historical weight and legitimacy by the time the 13th dynasty began more than a century later. A 13th dynasty king choosing to incorporate this name into his own royal identity, whether through genuine ancestral connection or deliberate political invocation, would be making a calculated statement about legitimacy during a period when, as we've seen repeatedly throughout this investigation, legitimate claims to the throne were becoming increasingly difficult to establish and defend amid rapid, unstable succession. If Amenemhat genuinely descended from or claimed meaningful connection to the earlier Antef line, his reign might represent an attempt to restore or reinforce a specific, prestigious royal lineage during a period when Egyptian kingship badly needed exactly this kind of stabilizing legitimacy. Alternatively, if the name was invoked without genuine ancestral basis, purely as a political tool to borrow prestige from an earlier, more secure dynasty, it would tell us something equally important about how precarious royal legitimacy had become by this point, a king apparently feeling the need to manufacture historical continuity. His own actual position may not have organically possessed. Mainstream Egyptological opinion tends toward caution on this specific question, noting that Egyptian naming conventions, including the reuse of prestigious earlier royal names, were common enough throughout Egyptian history that we shouldn't necessarily read deep genealogical significance into every case where a later king's name echoes an earlier one. Kings across multiple dynasties adopted throne names invoking previous rulers' prestige without claiming direct descent, a practice closer to political branding than genuine genealogical assertion. In this reading, Amenemhat's name doesn't necessarily indicate anything mysterious about his origins or legitimacy specifically. It may simply reflect a broader pattern of 13th dynasty kings drawing on Egypt's deeper royal history for legitimizing associations, a common enough strategy during periods of political instability that it requires no special explanation in this particular case. But other researchers, examining the specific timing and context of his reign within the broader 13th dynasty sequence, have wondered whether Amenemhat's case might represent something more specific. Evidence of competing claims to legitimacy actively circulating during this period, different factions or family lines each asserting connections to Egypt's more secure and prestigious past in an attempt to establish authority that the dynasty's actual rapidly shifting succession couldn't otherwise provide. If multiple 13th dynasty kings were making similar moves, invoking earlier prestigious names or lineages to bolster their own uncertain claims, this would suggest the entire concept of royal legitimacy during this period was under genuine strain, with kings actively competing not just for practical political control, but for the symbolic authority that made kingship meaningful in the first place. This question connects to a broader puzzle within 13th Dynasty studies that we've touched on throughout much of this investigation. The difficulty of determining whether the dynasty represented a single continuous line of legitimate succession, however unstable, or a series of competing, sometimes overlapping claims to the same throne, with the Turin King list's authors doing their best, generations later, to impose a clean sequential order onto what may have actually been a far messier, more contested reality. Amenemhet's name, sitting at the intersection of genuine historical continuity and possible political invention, offers a small but genuinely revealing window into exactly this larger uncertainty, a single case study in the broader question of how Egyptian kingship functioned and how it justified itself during one of its most genuinely unstable periods. The physical evidence, thin as it is, doesn't resolve this question either way. The objects bearing his name confirm his formal royal titulary and the basic fact of his reign, but they don't include the kind of extended genealogical inscription that might definitively settle whether his connection to the Ontif name reflected genuine lineage or calculated political strategy. We're left, as with so many kings from this crowded and thinly documented dynasty, working with fragments that raise more interpretive questions than they answer. What makes Amenemhet's case particularly worth sitting with, though, isn't really about him individually so much as what he represents for our understanding of this entire period. Every king we've examined from the 13th dynasty, from Sobekhotep's uncertain heir to Neferkare Sasemen's near-total documentary absence, to Khendjer's uncertain origins, adds another piece to a picture of Egyptian kingship under genuine sustained strain. An institution that had spent more than 1,000 years projecting stability and continuity, now forced to constantly reassert its own legitimacy through whatever means were available, including, apparently, the strategic invocation of names borrowed from a more secure and confident past. Did Amenemhet genuinely descend from Egypt's celebrated 11th dynasty reunifiers, carrying forward a real ancestral claim to legitimate rule during a period when such claims mattered more than ever? Or does his name represent something more revealing about the 13th dynasty as a whole, a king reaching backward into Egypt's more stable history, not because he was entitled to that legacy by blood, but because the throne he actually held needed all the borrowed prestige it could get? If borrowed prestige was one strategy for surviving the 13th dynasty's unstable throne, another strategy altogether appears in the career of a man who never claimed kingship at all, yet seems to have wielded an extraordinary, almost unprecedented degree of continuity across a period when pharaohs themselves could barely hold power for a single season. His name was Anku, and he held the office of Vizier, that same powerful administrative position we've already examined through Rekhmire's unfinished tomb, but operating here under circumstances almost entirely opposite to what we saw in the New Kingdom, where Rekhmire served two kings across a relatively stable succession. Anku's name appears on monuments and seal impressions spanning what scholars believe may have been the reigns of multiple different 13th dynasty pharaohs in rapid succession. A genuinely remarkable feat of political survival during precisely the period when, as we've traced throughout this investigation, kings themselves were rising and falling with startling speed. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it inverts the usual pattern we've encountered. Throughout the 13th dynasty, we've repeatedly found kings who left frustratingly little evidence behind, their reigns too brief to generate substantial records. Anku, by contrast, left behind a genuinely unusual volume of evidence for a non-royal official during this era, his name and title recurring across multiple sources in a way that suggests real, sustained administrative power, even as the men formerly occupying the throne above him changed with dizzying frequency. Some reconstructions place members of what appears to be his own family in the vizierate across successive generations, suggesting not just personal survival but something closer to an entrenched administrative dynasty operating in parallel to, and arguably more stable than, the official royal succession itself. This raises a genuinely pointed question. If Egypt's kings during this period were changing so rapidly that many left almost no trace, who was actually running the country day to day? The Vizier's office, as Rekhmire's own installation text makes clear, carried responsibility for the judiciary, taxation, and the practical administration of the entire kingdom, precisely the machinery of government that needed to function continuously, regardless of how quickly the throne itself changed hands. Anku's apparent longevity in this role suggests a possibility mainstream Egyptology takes seriously, that real administrative continuity during the 13th dynasty's most chaotic stretches may have rested not with the kings themselves, but with a small number of powerful entrenched officials like Anku, men whose practical control over the machinery of state may have mattered considerably more than whichever name happened to occupy the formal royal titulary in any given year. The straightforward reading treats this as a sensible, even necessary adaptation to genuinely unstable political conditions. When kings themselves couldn't be relied upon to provide continuity, a capable, experienced vizier, ideally one whose family could pass administrative expertise and court relationships down across generations, would have offered exactly the kind of institutional stability Egypt's practical governance required to keep functioning at all. In this reading, Anku isn't mysterious so much as a case study in how sophisticated bureaucratic states can maintain functional continuity even when their formal leadership becomes genuinely unstable, the machinery of government proving more durable than the individuals nominally in charge of it. But this explanation opens onto a more provocative question that some historians have been willing to ask directly. If Anku and officials like him held this much practical sustained power across multiple royal reigns, how much actual authority did the kings themselves retain during this period? Were 13th dynasty pharaohs, at least some of them, functioning as something closer to figureheads, their rapid succession reflecting not just external pressures and demographic misfortune, but an underlying reality where the vizierate, not the throne, represented the true seat of continuous power? If so, the entire framework we've used throughout much of this investigation, treating each king's rise and fall as the central story of this period, might need to be understood differently, with the more meaningful continuity, and perhaps the more meaningful political drama, playing out instead among officials like Anku, whose names rarely received the same attention as the kings they nominally served. This remains a genuinely debated question rather than a settled conclusion. Direct evidence for the internal politics of the Vizierat during this period is limited, and reconstructing exactly how much practical power Anku and his apparent successors actually wielded, versus how much initiative still rested with individual kings during their brief reigns, requires interpretation of fragmentary sources that don't always point in a single clear direction. Some Egyptologists caution against overstating the case, noting that apparent administrative continuity in the surviving record may partly reflect which sources happened to survive, rather than a fully accurate picture of where power actually resided at the time. What remains, across the scattered seals and monuments bearing his name, is a portrait of remarkable, almost anomalous stability, standing directly against the backdrop of the 13th dynasty's famously unstable throne. Anku governed, by the evidence available, across changes in kingship that toppled or ended the reigns of men who held the formal, sacred title he never claimed for himself. Was Anku simply an unusually capable administrator whose long service reflected personal skill and practical necessity in a genuinely difficult era? Or does his career suggest something more fundamental about where power actually lived during Egypt's most fractured centuries? A kingdom whose kings came and went while the men who actually ran it quietly, persistently, remained. That question, of where real continuity actually resided during Egypt's most unstable centuries, finds an unexpected answer in the reign of a king who did something almost none of his 13th dynasty contemporaries managed. He lasted. Merenre I's name appears with a frequency that immediately sets him apart from the parade of brief, thinly attested kings we've encountered throughout this dynasty. Scarab seals bearing his name have been found in numbers substantial enough that Egyptologists generally credit him with one of the longest reigns of the entire 13th dynasty, plausibly extending beyond 2 decades, an extraordinary span for a period we've repeatedly seen defined by kings who ruled for months rather than years. In a dynasty where Anku's administrative longevity stood out precisely because royal longevity was so rare, Merenre I represents something genuinely unusual, a king who achieved that same rare continuity from the throne itself. And this is exactly what makes the final years of his reign so puzzling. A king who ruled this long should have left behind the kind of substantial monumental and administrative record that lets historians reconstruct not just the fact of his reign, but its arc, its major events, and crucially, its ending. Instead, despite the relative abundance of scarab seals bearing his name, we have almost no detailed inscriptional evidence describing what he actually did across 2 decades of rule, and even less indicating how his reign concluded. No tomb has been confidently identified as his. No succession narrative survives explaining who followed him or under what circumstances the throne passed on. A king this durable, in a period this unstable, ought to represent a kind of anchor point for reconstructing 13th Dynasty chronology. Instead, he remains almost as elusive as the short-lived kings around him, just elusive in a different, more puzzling way. The scarabs themselves offer a partial explanation for at least some of this strangeness. Scarab seals were mass-produced administrative and personal objects, used for sealing documents and goods, and their widespread survival doesn't necessarily indicate the same kind of deliberate monumental commemoration that a temple inscription or tomb relief would represent. A king could generate enormous numbers of these small functional objects across a long reign without ever commissioning the kind of grand building projects or narrative inscriptions that give historians real texture and detail about a ruler's actual accomplishments. In this reading, Merenre's evidentiary profile isn't contradictory so much as simply consistent with a 13th Dynasty king operating with genuinely limited resources, even during an unusually long reign. He had the time to generate lots of small administrative objects, but perhaps never the sustained wealth or stability to commission the larger monuments that would have given later generations a fuller picture of his actual reign. But the sheer length of his rule makes this explanation feel somewhat incomplete on its own. 20 years, even under difficult conditions, is typically enough time for at least some substantial building activity, some monumental inscription commemorating a military campaign, a religious dedication, or simply the milestones of a long reign, the kinds of texts that even minor 13th Dynasty kings occasionally manage to leave behind despite ruling for far shorter periods. Why would the king who achieved the rare feat of actually holding power for 2 decades leave behind proportionally less narrative detail than some of his far briefer contemporaries? Some Egyptologists have proposed that Merenre's long reign may itself hold a clue to this puzzle, that his unusual longevity, in a dynasty this volatile, might reflect a ruler who succeeded specifically by avoiding the kind of ambitious disruptive actions, military campaigns, contested succession moves, major building projects requiring heavy taxation that could threaten a fragile hold on power. In this reading, the near absence of narrative inscription isn't a gap in the record so much as an accurate reflection of a genuinely cautious reign. A king who survived this long precisely by doing as little as possible to generate the kind of controversy or ambition that had toppled so many of his contemporaries. Others have looked instead at what happened to Egypt more broadly during and after his reign, noting that Merenre's decades on the throne overlap with a period when Hyksos' influence and control over the eastern delta appear to have been steadily increasing, even as Thebes and the traditional seat of 13th Dynasty authority struggled to maintain its own cohesion. If his long reign coincided with this gradual erosion of Egyptian territorial control, his relative silence in the monumental record might reflect not caution, but genuine constraint. A king whose authority, however durable in terms of simple survival, may have been steadily narrowing in actual territorial and political scope, even as he continued, technically, to hold the throne. What remains, scattered across collections of small inscribed scarabs with almost nothing to contextualize them, is the record of a king who managed what almost none of his contemporaries could, sustained rule across a genuinely difficult period, and yet left behind surprisingly little to tell us what that sustained rule actually accomplished, or how it eventually came to its end. Did Merenre survive 2 decades on Egypt's throne by deliberately avoiding the kind of ambition that ended so many other 13th Dynasty reigns prematurely? Or does his puzzling silence reflect a longer, quieter erosion, a king who held his title for longer than almost anyone else in his troubled dynasty, even as the kingdom itself was slipping further from his control with every passing year?